Section 19. The Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition and the Telegraph Line Commission. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. The Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition and the Telegraph Line Commission by Candido Mariano da Silva Rondon. Translation by Richard George REIDY and Edwin Douglas Murray. Third lecture, Part 6. Up to this point, I have restricted myself in the present exposition to only consider the results obtained by the Telegraph Lines Commission in the execution of the principal part of a series of work entrusted to it, not only to cross and explore the great wilderness of the northwest of Mato Grosso, but also to occupy it and open it up definitely to the joint activities which characterize the civilization and the life of our country. To relate in a simple lecture all the measures adopted by the Commission to bring such a great undertaking to a successful end is a difficult task, and I do not propose to attempt same. But on the whole, in the work effected there are many aspects of restricted interest, for they are of a technical order, and there is a part which, on this occasion, I cannot fail to mention, lest the nature and motive of the efforts exerted to obtain that object should remain unknown. I refer to the geographical surveying expeditions with which the Commission not only studied the natural resources which there are to be turned to account in the explored regions, as well as the course to be pursued in order to facilitate the installation of a double movement of coming in and going out, on which the life of such a considerable and important segment of the national territory depends. I will here, therefore, give a rapid glance over the capital conclusions at which these expeditions arrived, declaring, however, that I am sorry to see myself obliged, owing to the limited space into which I must confine my exposition, to pass over in silence, or without giving them all the enhancement they merit, numerous passages wherein are set out the strength and beauty of the character, the energy, and the intelligence of the Brazilian citizens who undertook them, and eventually carried them out. They were chiefly the officers of our army who conducted and accomplished them. As we all know, the region that served as the stage for the enactment of the rare aptitudes of its fearless explorers can be defined from a hydrographical point of view by the basins of 5 large collectors, the Paraguay, the Guaporé, the Madeira, the Juruena, and the Tapajóz, which, nevertheless, taken jointly, form but 3 distinct arteries, whereas the third is an extension of the second, and the last is the continuation of its precedent. Consequently, I shall put together the work of which I am now about to give a short notice around the central courses of these 3 basins, displaying them in the order in which they increase in importance in regard to the multiplicity of the material which they have respectively supplied for the present exposition. In the basin of the Paraguay we shall have to detain ourselves but a short while. The river from which it takes its name is known since the colonial days, not only by reason of the constant navigation which has at all times been carried on along its course, but also from the topographical plan of the same which was organized by the Portuguese Border Commission, of which Ricardo Franco, Lacerda y Almeida, and Silva were members. Notwithstanding this, however, there is yet a correction to be made therein as regards the determination of its headwaters. It had been admitted almost without divergency that the Sete Lagoas was the principal feeder of the Paraguay, but the first survey made by the Telegraph Lines Commission led us to ascertain the superiority, not only as regards volume of water, but even as regards the extension of the Ribeiro Amolar, to which, on the ground of these 2 facts alone, its precedence in the formation of the Paraguay pertained. In the chapter dealing with the geographical conclusions with which I closed the report of the great surveys and reconnaissances of 1907 through 1909, I made mention of this correction as one of those which it is necessary to introduce in the map of Mato Grosso from the parallel 14 degrees 25 minutes and the meridian 13 degrees 16 minutes west of Rio de Janeiro up to parallel 10 degrees and the meridian 21 degrees. We can now say that to the conditions previously enumerated may be added the consideration in favor of the Amolar that its course maintains the same direction generally, which is a condition proper to a main river. Thus, once again, the necessity of introducing the said correction in the map of Mato Grosso. We have not lost sight that the anthropo-geographical argument weighs in favor of the Sete Lagoas, but we must also consider that the value of this argument is not of such a nature as to be able to destroy the indications resulting from the continuity of the general direction of the collector, its extension and volume. Besides, we all know the opinion of Bartolome Rossi, to which I referred in the said chapter of the geographical conclusions, of the report on the surveys and reconnaissances of 1907 through 1909. This opinion is contrary to the designation of the Sete Lagoas as the main branch of the Paraguay, and awards the precedence to the Amolar. The same impression was gathered by Dr. Hercules Florence, a member of the expedition under Count Langsdorff, when he saw the two rivers. In describing the region traversed by the Amolar, he says, "We crossed thick woods of guaguacus, through which winds a river called Pedras de Amolar. Not far from this place it receives another, which is so narrow that I gave a jump to cross it, but which has already the name of Paraguay-Sinjo, and comes from the Sete Lagoas, which are known as the headwaters of the Paraguay, and lay at a distance of half a league at most. This denomination should more properly apply to the river Pedras de Amolar, which runs down from a place some 4 leagues distant, and possesses a larger volume of water, but nevertheless, after the junction with the Paraguay-Sinjo, the pompous and famous name of Paraguay already appears." The Sete Lagoas, 7 lakes, were so close that we could not restrain the desire of seeing them. Going to the left, in less than an hour we came to swampy ground, where one can see marshes and here and there the Buriti palms. There is nothing remarkable to distinguish the sight. A little stream flows therefrom, and this is the Paraguay-Sinjo. From this passage of Dr. Hercules Florence's book, and from the opinion of Bartolome Rossi, it can be seen that the correction indicated by me, although against the choice of the dwellers on the Paraguay, in compensation it bears out the mode of thought of the old explorers, who were sufficiently enlightened, and had the occasion of ascending as far as the headwaters of the river, and personally comparing the two feeders. If we should now wish to form an idea of the configuration of the beginning of the great basin, of the famous feeder of the estuary of the River Plate, let us imagine that we are ascending same, and are journeying to the north of parallel 15 degrees. Continuing our voyage in this sense, in the northeast quadrant, we will arrive at a point where we see it dividing itself in 2 branches. One, directing itself to the northwest, becomes decidedly asymmetric in relation to the axis of the river which we are ascending. The other, however, slightly more voluminous, conserves the direction of its axis. The first is the Santana, the second of the Paraguay-Sinjo. Therefore the name of Paraguay only exists from below the confluence of these 2 rivers. As among these, it is the Paraguay-Sinjo which possesses the characteristics of being the prolongation of the trunk. We will continue to ascend same. We will have gone very little upstream when we will have met on our right the mouth of a small river which is called the Brumado. Still continuing our journey, we will pass in front of the bar of another river on our left, where is to be found the town of Diamantino, which it crosses. We still ascend. We now penetrate in the Planalto, and there we see the Paraguay Zinjo, dividing itself into two branches, the larger and more voluminous, and besides this, the one which we must continue to ascend in order not to change the general direction in which we are traveling. This is known under the name of Pedras de Amolar. The other preserves the name of Paraguay Zinjo, and a little further on will have terminated in the marshlands and swamps or little pools to which Hercules Florence referred. These little pools are those which received the name of Sete Lagoas, 7 lakes, and were those indicated as being the sources of the famous Paraguay. We will now leave for another occasion the allusion which we intended to make to a few notions collected with regard to the headwaters of the Cuyabá, and will now pass to the valley of the Guaporé. With regard to the Guaporé, like the Paraguay, known and navigated ever since the colonial days, I will limit myself to refer to the principal results of an expedition which I ordered to leave from Vilhena in September 1912, under the direction of the North American mining engineer Moritz, to study the course of a river which ran into it, and whose headwaters had been noted in the Campos de Conmemoración de Floriano by the 1909 expedition. Following in the remains of a cutting which I had opened in 1909, and afterwards prolonging same, the engineer Moritz recognized that the above-mentioned river, named by us Viado Preto, is the tributary of a river which rises in the southeast, and which at the time received the expressive designation of Nha Se, I do not know. Having made a canoe, the engineer continued the exploration downstream during a few more days, but encountering unsurpassable difficulties, and with the few men at his disposal, of whom many had become laid up, he returned to Vilhena bringing me information which permitted me to identify the river Nha with the Corumbiara, whose mouth in the Guaporé is a short distance off the village of Guajaru, belonging to Bolivia. But the most interesting result of Engineer Moritz's expedition was the confirmation of the existence of a magnificent gold mine, which was found on the surface of the ground under the same conditions in which the Portuguese had formerly found gold in Cuyabá. I believe these mines were the celebrated Urucumacuan, the wealth of which such marvels were told in the colonial days. On the other hand, as the Corumbiara, through the above-mentioned Viado Preto, is the watershed of the Pimenta Bueno, and as in 1909 we verified the existence of gold between this river and the Barrio del Melgazo, one can conclude that those gold fields extend through a considerable region from parallel 13 degrees as far as a point very much to the north of 12 degrees. Besides this mining wealth, one must also mention in the slopes of the Guaporé the wealth which exists in all their forests, where abundant specimens of Hevea brasiliensis and Bertholletia excella grow. Engineer Moritz's expedition not only encountered numerous signs of Indians, but also saw a few groups of same. He did not arrive, however, at entering into relations with them, because they fled immediately they perceived the approach of the members of his expedition. Withal, the engineer thinks that they belong to a different nation from that of the Nambequaras. End of section 19. Section 20 of the Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition and Telegraph Line Commission. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. The Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition and the Telegraph Line Commission by Candido Mariano da Silva Rondon. Translation by Richard George Reedy and Edwin Douglas Murray. Third Lecture, Part 7. If we accompany the course of the Guaporé and continue along the Madeira, the first river which we will meet after the Corumbiara, studied by the Telegraph Lines Commission, is the Jacy-Paraná. In my lectures of 1911, I explained how the error of the geographical charts with regard to the course and the position attributed to this river led me to include it in the plan of the great 1909 expedition. Therefore, it is now known that I detached a party under the direction of Captain Manuel Theófilo da Costa Pinheiro to that river, whose principal objective was to await the arrival of the expedition which had left from Tiparo-Poen, directing itself across the Sertão dos Parises, and of the Nambiquaras, to a point in which the parallel of 10 degrees is cut by the meridian of 20 degrees west of Rio de Janeiro. At this point the charts marked the headwaters of the Jacy-Paraná. The fact, however, was quite another, because what exists there is the Jamary, and the parallel of 10 degrees only intercepts the course of the Jacy after passing the meridian of 21 degrees. The consequence of this error in the charts was that the members of the expedition coming from Tiparo-Poen had to get out into the Madeira through the Jamary, without having the benefit of the assistance which was awaiting them on another river. However, the efforts made by Captain Costa Pinheiro and by his assistant, Lieutenant Amilcar Armando Botelho de Magalhães, were not lost. On the contrary, they were most useful for the progress of the geographical knowledge of important regions in our country. As it is impossible to here give a summary of all the notable achievements of the expedition under Captain Costa Pinheiro, I will limit myself to cite the enumeration which he himself made in his report, already published, of the work effected on the Jacy. He proceeded with a topographic survey of the river, from the mouth in latitude south 9 degrees 10 minutes 56 seconds 93, and in latitude west of Rio de Janeiro 21 degrees 18 minutes 22 seconds 20, up to the Cachoeira Grande, in latitude south 10 degrees 23 minutes 56 seconds 40, and in latitude west of Rio de Janeiro 20 degrees 51 minutes 38 seconds 10, with a linear development of 323.926 meters. Soundings were made in the canal. Thermometrical and barometrical observations of the whole of the extension surveyed were taken. Determination of the transverse section and discharge of all the affluents and the waterfalls, and valuation of the theoretic and effective potentials of the falls and rapids encountered. Determination of the geographical position of the most important points on the river, the calculation of the altitudes of a series of noted heights. The Rio Jacy-Paraná, says Captain Costa Pinheiro, should have its sources on the Serra dos Parises, which from Cachoeira Campo Grande is perfectly visible to the observer in a slightly oblique direction to the general direction of the river. From the observations which I made, I should say that its course at the outside could attain an average of 400 kilometers. Its general direction is southeast, and its tendency is more to the east than to the south. The river, in all its extension, is very winding, and the long stretches are rare. Its bed is very variable, and one can even affirm that up to this day the river has not yet fixed it. During the dry season one can navigate almost always over its primitive bed. In winter, however, every now and again one penetrates into a fresh bed, generally narrow and undefined, and which the river has prepared during the flooding season. As regards the affluents, some deserve special mention, inasmuch as they already possess the appearance of rivers, such as those called Canto, Formoso, Capivari, and Igarapé, all on the left bank, and on the right bank the Branco and the Igarapé da Divisa. As regards the population, the Jacy is occupied by rubber tappers nearly as far as the Cachoeira Grande, but its primitive inhabitants are the Parintintis Indians, who, oppressed by the rubber tappers, are pushed back to the forests in the highest points of the valley of the river. On ascending the Jacy, Captain Costa Pinheiro had one of his canoes attacked by these Indians who thought they recognized, in the physician of the expedition, Dr. Paulo dos Santos, a rubber tapper who persecuted them most cruelly. We will now see the terms in which Captain Pinheiro himself describes the attack. The fact, which so much grieved us, occurred on the 2nd of September at 4 p.m. a little above the Paraguay da Esperança, 137 kilometers distant from the mouth. We had not yet made 3 stages after the passage of the above-mentioned Paraguay, when we heard cries for help which came from the canoe in front of us. Losing no time, we rushed to the point whence came the cries, perceiving as we got nearer the exclamations, "The Indians! The Indians!" coming from 2 men who were struggling in the water. We promptly fired a series of shots into the air, whilst the canoe arrived at the spot where the 2 men who, bad swimmers, were endeavoring in a supreme effort to reach the other side of the river. Having taken them into our boat, we directed ourselves to the canoe which was alongside the bank of the river, in which was Dr. Paulo dos Santos, who, with 3 arrows in his body, was bleeding and unconscious. Having taken him into our canoe, which was the bigger and more commodious, we endeavored to discover a missing man. This man, who was sick, his companions declared, had thrown himself into the water after having been wounded by an arrow. All our efforts to find him were in vain. As it was now getting dark, we returned to the camp a little beyond the point where the attack commenced, in order to attend to the wounded. Dr. Paulo presented 2 large wounds on the left arm near the elbow, and another in the abdomen. This last wound was very slight. The other man, Eugenio Martins Afonso, showed a small wound on the left thigh. Early on the following day I sent a well-manned canoe to search for the other man who had disappeared, for there was a supposition that he had gained and remained on the opposite bank of the river. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon the canoe returned with the body of the unfortunate José da Silva, which showed a large wound produced by an arrow in the ribs. On the bank of the river I dug a grave and buried him. He was a good man, disciplined, very quiet, and a worker. His death upset us very much, and produced great terror amongst our personnel. After this sad accident, the expedition continued and terminated its work without any further annoyance beyond the natural privations in common with those lonely and wild places, accompanied by sickness and tropical fevers, which seriously attacked Captain Pinheiro and his devoted assistant, Lieutenant Amilcar de Magalhães. If we continue from the mouth of the Jacy to descend the Madeira, we will pass in front of the town of Santo Antonio, and following on we will find the entry of another river entirely explored and studied by the Telegraph Line Commission. This is the Jamary, which, for the first time, we had run over in 1909, having reached through the course of one of its subtributaries, the river Pardon. The conditions under which this took place, and the observations collected in this first journey, have already been expounded in the public lectures of 1911. The telegraph line in the part constructed by the north section leaves Santo Antonio in a direction almost due east. It crosses the river Candeias, reaches the Jamary, crosses it, and follows along its course from north to south up to the bar of the Canaan, where in 1909 we encountered the Paraguay de Bom Futuro, and where the telegraph station Araquimes exists today. In maps previous to the work of the Telegraph Lines Commission, as for example, in those of Horace E. Williams under the title of O Acre e a Frontiera entre o Brasil y a Bolivia, Acre and the Brazilian-Bolivian Frontier, emphasized with the declaration conforme o Tratado de Petrópolis, according to the Treaty of Petropolis, the highest headwaters of the Jamary figure extended to the south of parallel 12 degrees, in the middle of the section determined by the meridians of 17 degrees and 18 degrees. By this localization, the Jamary would have to cut the valley of the Gy-Paraná, passing over the rivers Barrio de Melgaço, Pimenta Bueno, Rolem de Mura, and Ricardo Franco, in short, over all the affluents of the left of the Gy, without counting the mountain ranges which would have to be crossed, such as the Expedição and das Onças. Such terrible anarchy in the domains of geography does not in fact exist, because the Jamary limits itself to extend its bed of scarcely 400 kilometers, up to a little below parallel 10 degrees, but without barely passing to the east of meridian 20 degrees. Of the two principal branches of which we can consider it to be formed, one already brings from its sources the name which it maintains until entering the Madeira, and the other is called the Canaan. On leaving this place, where the confluence occurs, in latitude 10 degrees 2 minutes, it successively receives the waters of the rivers Branco, Preto, and Verde, the two first of which I have previously mentioned, and on the left those of the Messangana and the already mentioned Candeias, whose volume is almost equal to it, and its mouth is not more than 25 kilometers from the point in which the two united lose themselves in the Madeira. With regard to the population, we already know that the Jamary, besides being largely inhabited by white people who are employed in the extraction of India rubber and caoutchouc, possesses two Indian tribes, one called Bocas Pretas and the other Arequimes. The first, who are settled between the rivers Branco and Preto, are even to this day persecuted by the invaders of their forests. With regard to the second lot, whose real name is Ahopovo, the name of Arequimes being taken from the Yoruba vocabulary, I will relate their short and very sad history, from the moment that they came into contact with the white people up to the time in which the Telegraph Lines Commission took them under their protection. In the beginning of 1911, the Sertanajos, who collected caoutchouc and established themselves along the Messangana, began to get as far as the headwaters of this river, where the Arequimi villages were to be found. The persecution of the Indians commenced on this occasion. In the month of June, these caoutchouc tappers resolved to make a general onslaught against their malocas. Guided by the tracks opened in the forests by the Indians themselves, they succeeded in discovering one of the malocas. They surrounded same in the early morning whilst they were at work, and suddenly opened fire, and the bullets from their Winchesters rained upon their huts. The unfortunate Indian men, women, and children only thought of flight, frightened out of their lives. One, however, named Ogunho, fell assassinated by the gunfire. The assailants, now in possession of the village, sacked it, and as the time was not sufficient for them to terminate the nefarious work which they had planned, they returned on the following day with more companions. They separated what was still left as being good and useful, and what they rejected they smashed and burnt, leaving everything reduced to ashes. The rubber plantations of Messangana belonged to Mr. Francisco de Castro. But still further up above the mouth of this river on the Jamary, there existed already at that time other rubber tappers' establishments, namely those belonging to the brothers Arruda. With one of these I conversed regarding the brutal occurrences, and persuaded him to use, and cause to be adopted by his men employed on the rubber forests, more humane treatment worthy of our civilization, or at least such as would not cause us to blush when one remembers that it was used by Brazilians against their brothers inside the mother country. Future events took upon themselves to prove that my appeal had not been made in vain. On the contrary, they were fully corresponded to in the sentiments and thoughts of the person to whom my appeal had been directed, viz., Mr. Godofredo Arruda. In fact, in the following year, 1912, the employees of this proprietor, following at all hazards the instructions which they had received, succeeded in establishing pacific and friendly relations with the Araquimes, who frequently visited his rubber estate. The notice of this success was not long in getting known to the gaucho men of the Masagana, who, changing their tactics, but not their purpose, established friendly relations with the Indians. Thus they succeeded in being admitted into the villages of that river, and once in them they immediately commenced to commit the greatest abuse, provoking the disorganization of the Indian families, and demoralized the customs and institutions of the Araquimes. Under the action of this deleterious influence, the tribe commenced to rapidly dissolve itself. Their inhabitants, taken away from the villages, were disseminated through all the barasoes of the rubber estates on the Masagana, and as far as the Candeias, where most of them died of avaria and defluxo, diseases which amongst the Indians of the Amazon assume the proportions of a terrible epidemic and cause enormous mortality. In February 1913, at Manaos, where I had arrived from Rio de Janeiro, I learned that a couple of young Araquimi boys had been taken to Belém do Pará by the owner of a rubber estate on the Masagana. It was necessary to hand them back to their tribe and family, and for this reason I demanded and obtained through the Inspectorate of the Service for the Protection of the Indians in that city police intervention, which caused the boys to be taken out of the hands of their detainer. Abuses of the nature of those to which I have just referred unfortunately occur in our country more frequently than one would reasonably expect, inasmuch as we, being a duly organized nation, the authorities should know that the first and the most noble of all their duties is to afford protection to those of their compatriots, who, by reason of their weakness or ignorance, may be exposed to violent treatment, dispensed openly or otherwise by individuals or groups of individuals who are powerful and prepotent. As evidence of what I have just stated, I will mention that on the same occasion, and whilst in Manaos, I was obliged to demand the assistance of the police of the state of Amazonas to stop the Frenchman Labadie, ex-chief of the Mollard mission, from leaving for Europe, taking with him, as he had intended, an Indian of the Wapochana tribe whom he had brought from the upper Rio Branco. Having succeeded in this, I left Manaos, taking the direction of the Jamary. Whilst I was ascending the Madeira, from all sides I received complaints that various families withheld in their power many Araquemi children. Then I went to fetch them and took them with me, and continued the voyage, taking them back to their villages, which I was determined to reconstitute and protect. Amongst these children, those named Pariba, Poroya, and Antina were handed over to me seriously ill, so much so that on arriving at my camp in the Torno Largo on the Jamary, I had to leave them in charge of the Commission's physician. From the camp I continued the journey upstream, taking with me the Indian boys Opuna and Patama. On the 8th of March I took out from a launch belonging to some rubber tappers who were coming downstream a group of 16 Indians, amongst whom was the mother of these boys. The poor woman appeared to have gone mad with joy at seeing her sons, who had been snatched away from her, and whom she had thought lost forever. The last part of the voyage by land was most arduous. It rained incessantly, and the Indians, sick and worn out, could scarcely walk. Finally we arrived at their villages. The state of misery which I there encountered was enough to make the hearts even of the most hard-hearted bleed. Many of them had been destroyed by fire, the plantations and barns had been sacked and robbed, the women kidnapped and outraged. The children had been stolen and carried away. Sickness hitherto unknown had appeared, and was causing a mortality never before seen. In fact, the tribe which, at the moment of entry into relations with the rubber tappers, was at least 600 in number, could now scarcely muster more than 60. I do not wish, however, to delay in contemplating this picture more than sad, depressive, and, why not say it, a shameful example of the perverse and destructive ferocity which assails civilized men when they have not the break of a human ideal, civic and planetary, capable of directing them and moralizing the employment of the enormous forces which science and industry placed in their hands, leaving them, however, the liberty to judge, according to their sentiments and to their intentions, the choice to apply them to good or evil. End of section 20. Section 21. The Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition and the Telegraph Lines Commission. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. The Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition and the Telegraph Lines Commission by Candido Mariano da Silva Rondon. Translation by Richard George Reedy and Edwin Douglas Murray. Third lecture, Part 8. I prefer to tell you a little which will permit you to know more or less the misery and wildness of the Arikimi nation. In their territory, reduced to ruins, between the Masingana and the Candeias, there still existed at the time of my visit 4 villages. I went to those which were directed by the chiefs, or upos, Titunha, Pioya, and Curaki. The other, which I did not see, was governed by Upo Pinduro. Each one consisted of 3 large dwellings, and of 1 pujico, or ranch, destined to keep the articles of the religious cult of this nation. The houses are formed like the shell of the tattoo. One of its extremities, however, terminates in a kind of dome, which presents the only aperture of the whole construction. It is the entrance to the Arikimi hut, 1 meter 70 centimeters high and 0.60 wide. In this detail this hut appears like that of the Urumis, but differs from that of the Nambequaras and of the Kepekiri Uats, who use 2 openings. The framework of the houses is made with 6 posts, standing at the extremities in 2 groups of equal number. Those of the same group are joined together by a crosspiece, which rests on 2 raising pieces placed at a height of 2 meters .50, and each pair of symmetrical posts of the 2 groups sustains the top of the building. On these tops are passed from one side to the other flexible rods which are curved and give the dome form to the construction. From the extremity of the roof to the ground there is a big arch, reinforced in the upper part, which serves to sustain the rods of the dome structure. The coconut palm leaves, with which they make the covering of the roof, are placed diagonally on the rods and fastened to them with great art, forming a completely united and closed surface. In the interior of the houses may be seen not only the sleeping hammocks, earthenware vases, baskets, calabashes, and numerous other articles manufactured by the Arikimis, but also the graves of their dead, who are buried exactly under the hammock which they occupied during their lifetime. The earthenware pots have all of them the shape of the body of a cone. Some are large, called burro, 1 meter high and 50 centimeters wide at the mouth, and others much smaller, called ikoio. In each house there were always to be found 1 of the first kind and 3 of the second, full of totó, a fermentated beverage made from corn or manioc. There is also a long trough of 4 meters 40 inches length, with a width of 28 centimeters, cut out of a special sort of wood. It serves to break up the corn and to mash up the manioc root, which is carried out with the assistance of a stone or granite grinder of an elliptical shape, whose axis measures at the longest portion 0.40 and 0.22 at the shortest. I have already referred to the pujico or hut, especially consecrated to the religious cult of the Arakimes. I will now describe same. On entering one of these houses one finds a hammock (erembe) made out of cotton cloth, whose exceptional whiteness is immediately noticed and which is carefully and intentionally maintained. The hammock is stretched in the direction of the roof of the pujico, heaped with ornaments of feathers from the red arara, and trinkets of polished shells displayed in triangles of small circles. From the roof hangs down over it the skin of a spotted jaguar, stretched out with rods and full of feather ornaments. Still in the roof are to be seen calabashes for drinking totó, pieces of wood used for producing fire, wrapped round with cord, a dark polished stone in the shape of a trihedral sphere, a small axe, pute ejao, made of stone, and numerous polished shells. On the walls bundles of old bows and arrows which belonged to some veteran dweller of the village, and still more arrows with bamboo points, very much like those used by the Katipunas and the Parintintins, from whom probably they had been taken in warfare. The principal object in this place is the hammock. Nevertheless, on first examination, nothing more can be seen than two bundles, one a long one and the other shaped like a cap terminating in a point, and so large that if placed on the head of any man it would descend over his face down to his chin. Both these are carefully rolled up in the wide inner bark of a certain tree, which is known to the Indians under the name of evotuera. The long volume is simply placed at the back of the hammock. The other, however, is sewn to the latter so as to keep the upper part of same on top. Of the two volumes so zealously guarded, one, the long one, encloses the bones of the body of an Arequime hero, and the round one contains his skull. On examining the pujico carefully we will observe that there are preserved all the spoils of the hero. His hair, divided into two plates, hang down on the outside of each end of the hammock, and the teeth in the interior of a small basket, or chiropamoita, is suspended from the roof over the same deathbed. The use of a special house dedicated to religious practices is not peculiar only to the Arequimes. Even in the wilds of northwest Mato Grosso there are two other tribes, the Parisis and the Quepequiriuats, who possess same. But the special form of this cult, so manifestly dedicated to the memory of a hero, this, yes, I believe to be exclusively practiced by this nation, and I even think that in the whole of America there has not been registered any other case which, such as this, makes us remember the celebrated theory of Evermeras. Individually considered, the Arequimes present varied and different grades of color, which run from the well-defined bronze, as for example of the chief Titunja, up to the Japanese yellow, which we saw in the Indian woman Aranjo. Some of them were very dark, or avayunas, like the boy Opuña, and others are light in color, or ava de juice, like the chief Curaki. Their stomachs are very much developed, aquiline noses with a depression in the upper part. Their eyes are small and very black, sharp and oblique, as in the same Indian woman Aranjo, which are characteristically Japanese. A sclerotic yellow, eyebrows and eyelashes not abundant. The hair is very fine and silky, such as might denounce a remote European cross. Their hands are of an average size, badly shaped, long fingers, nails like those of the Nambiquaras, large feet with the big toe wide open and the other toes very thick with flat nails. The teeth are generally in good condition, although imperfectly disposed in their maxillaries, almost invariably one on top of the other, the lower maxillary long and exceeding the upper. Only the men pierce their ears in the earlobe and place therein small twigs or feathers. They do not pierce their lips or their noses. They paint their bodies with urucum and jenipapo. They do not pull out their hair or cut their mustaches or the beard on their chins. Before they get into relations with civilized people, they wear their hair long and tied at the end with fiber. All the members, both male and female, of this tribe use garters made out of plaited cotton yarn, pio picaturo, above their ankles. They eat soft corn, manioc, monkey nuts, bananas, papayas, wild fruit, game, and fish. They are very intelligent, of a kindly disposition, and not warlike. They learn our language very easily and rapidly. This, in a few words, is the Arakimi tribe, the remains of which the Telegraph Commission succeeded in saving from general destruction to which it was condemned, owing to the influence of the bad elements to which I have already alluded. In order to attain our object, the Commission gave them, near the last station on the Jamary, the lands which they required in order to establish their villages and plantations. There they are now settled, and live peacefully occupied in recovering from their past misfortunes, and preparing themselves to enjoy the advantages of our civilization, which they endeavor to understand and assimilate. One of the chiefs, wishing to hasten the advent of the era of the redemption of the Arakimi people, asked me to educate one of his sons according to our system. Acceding to this request, I brought his boy Pariba Parakina Piuaka with me. He will be included in the list of scholars at the professional institution of São José. Many people in this capital, in Cambuquira, and in other places know the boy Pariba, and when they hear him talking so easily and correctly in Portuguese, as if he had learnt same from his mother, when they see his gentle and polite manners, when they appreciate the vivacity of his intelligence and paused conversation, the sweetness of his frank and liberal nature, it will be difficult for them to believe that scarcely 2 years ago he lived in the backwoods of a virgin forest, forming an integral part of a tribe of miserable Indians, unknown, persecuted, and massacred. Cases like this boy's are numerous and common, not only among the Arakimis, but also amongst other Indians of Brazil. Those who are acquainted with them know by experience that the dispositions both moral and mental of which they are doted present the most admirable facilities for the modifying action which well-intentioned people may intend to exercise over them, in the sense of inducing them to abandon their old habits and accept those common to us. The essential thing is to merit and inspire confidence. Once this is obtained, the road is prepared for their veneration, which in them is intense and strong, and which, once awakened, begins immediately to produce its known fruits, for they are prone to imitate all they see and admire in the object of their veneration. We, however, cannot be more lengthy in the appreciation of these facts. The road is still long over which we have to pass in order to review all the corners of the wilderness opened up by the Telegraph Line Commission. Let us, therefore, descend from the Jamary to the Madeira, and having arrived at the latter, let us continue to descend it. The first mouth of importance which we strike is that of the Gy-Paraná, also called Machado do Mar. We can say that we already know it, so often and so repeatedly have we been referring to it in the course of these lectures. We need not recall how it is represented in the geographical charts of Pimenta Bueno, Rio Branco, and Horace Williams. We have already seen that in all these maps, while profoundly divergent from one another, the only thing that is to be found is the position of the mouth and its name. Even this is subject to a restriction, because the last of the writers cited inscribes at the spot which should contain the double denomination Gy or Machado the word Pirayanara. I shall thus limit myself to giving a rapid description of its course, such as it is and as it has become known, after being studied in its whole length by the Telegraph Lines Commission. at Campos do Comemoracio de Floriano, the admirable springs of 3 great hydrographical basins of the Guaporé, the Madeira, and the Tapajóz, laying at an altitude of an average of 630 meters above sea level, 2 rivers rise, and, as they were yet unknown at the time, received from the members of the 1909 expedition, one the same name of the Campos, and the other that of Pimenta Bueno. Both run down almost together from the station of Vilhena and in the direction of northwest from a spot a little before the meridian 17 degrees to that of 18 degrees, where, at a point above the parallel 12 degrees, they unite and thus form the upper Gy-Paraná. The first one, of a lesser volume of water and having its source lower down, is the more eastern. The other, more important than the former, starts under the name of Piroculuina, which was given to it also in 1909, and in its turn is the result of the junction of 2 branches respectively noted under the Kepekiri-Uat names of Dijaru Juperara, Red River, and Dijaru Uerebe, Brilliant River or Shiny River. After its formation, the Gy penetrates into the section of the meridians 18 degrees and 19 degrees west of Rio de Janeiro. At first it continues to run in a northwesterly direction. Soon after, however, it directs its course due north, and thus maintains it up to parallel 10 degrees. Thence it descends 1 more degree bending towards the east, reaching the latitude 9 degrees, but when about to pass this latitude it abandons abruptly the direction in which it had been flowing and again throws its course to the northwest. It rapidly crosses the meridian 19 degrees and reaches the Madeira before attaining that of 20 degrees, at a point close on to parallel 8 degrees. A noteworthy fact is that during such a long course the Gy receives on its right bank only 2 affluents of any importance, namely the rivers called San Joao and Taruma. And it is also remarkable that beyond this singularity, the bar of the first mentioned is exactly on the apex of the elbow formed by reason of the abrupt change of direction from north-northeast to northwest. In contrast with this, we have an abundance of affluents on the left bank. In the gap comprised between the 2 main feeders, the Comemoracio de Floriano and the Pimenta Bueno, appears the Barrio del Melgaço, already known to us. After the junction of the 2 feeders we meet first the Luis de Albuquerque, inhabited by the Uatu-Rambo tribe, and then the bar of the former San Pedro or Rolim de Mura, a river of still dark waters, into which run 2 others, the Antonio Joayo and the Anta Aterada. The more important of the 2 is the Rolim de Mura, properly denominated Dijaru Uara by the Kepekiri Uats, who also gave me the name of Capua as the designation of the tribe which lives there. The San Pedro is followed by the former Muqui, the trunk of the Lacerda y la Meda, the Luis d'Alencourt, the Akanga Peranga, and of the Ricardo Franco, which is the principal branch, below the mouth of which the Uacucap Indians are settled, according to the information of the said Kepekiri Uats. Descending further, we meet the Urapá, the Igarapé, the Boa Vista, the Jaru, with which we are acquainted, and others which have not yet been mentioned, namely the Anari, the Machadinho, the Juruasinho, and finally, on arriving at the Madeira, the Rio Preto. If we consider these indications in connection with those which we have already given in treating of the construction, we will see that the valley of the Gy-Paraná may be estimated as one of the richest and most varied ethnographical centers of the whole world. There we meet the civilized man, handling such remarkable and perfect implements of the industries of our days as the telegraph and gas motors, beside the uncultured caboclo, The tame and half-civilized Indian, the aborigine scarcely initiated in the first steps of relationship with us, the wild Indian not yet reached, and even finally the almost extinct cannibal. One might say that chance had made it a point to assemble in that strip of land a multiplicity of aspects under which nature manifests herself a little everywhere. In the soil we find gold and mercury, diamonds and granite. The majestic forests covered with precious essences are rich, even as compared with the prodigious resources of the Amazon forests, but in certain places fall off to harsh and desolate jungles, and in others opening up into level camps covered with beautiful grasses. And this multiplicity of aspects is so great that we cannot think of detailing same. Even with regard to the population, many nuclei remain to be mentioned. We have said nothing, for example, of the Yurumis, inhabitants of the valley of the Taruma, the river which the Gy collects on its right bank halfway up its total course, and of the Parintintins, a warlike tribe whose pacification we are promoting with the promised success of a near victory, and whose villages are to be found in a portion of the natural camps which extend to the right in the direction of the river Roosevelt, cut by the Marmelos and the Manicoré, direct affluents of the Madeira. End of section 21.
Section 22 of the Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition and the Telegraph Line Commission. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition and the Telegraph Line Commission by Candido Rondon, translated by R.G. REIDY and Edwin Murray. Third lecture, Part 9. Such a vast subject cannot evidently be included in the review of a rapid exposition like this. We will therefore retrace our steps and reascend the course of the Gy up to its vast headwaters in the Campos de Commemoração de Floriano. There we will see still the sources of two more rivers belonging to the hydrographical basin which we are now examining. One is the Roosevelt, and the other the Ananaz, a name which had scarcely commenced to figure in the geography of Brazil when it had to be changed, through what painful misfortune we already know, in order to give place to the perpetuation of the memory of the unfortunate Lieutenant Marques de Souza. In the lectures relative to the work of the Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition, we described the first one minutely. With regard to the second, in spite of the fact that we had not considered same in such detail, we judged that all the allusions made to it in various places in these lectures, and more especially in that which relates to the discovery of the river Capitão Cardoso, are sufficient to make known the essential characteristics of its course. We would still have to mention the principal episodes of the voyage, so full of hardships and difficulties during the exploration, which was being directed and carried out by Lieutenant Marques de Souza, with that great technical competency and high moral character which we all know, at least those who had the fortune of being his friends and companions of work, accustomed to admire all the acts of his professional and private life. As, however, we had the good fortune to find, in worthy friends belonging to the staff of the Jornal de Comercio, full sympathy with the desire which we nourished to bestow on the memory of our much regretted companion one of the many homages of which we recognize we are indebted, we are placed in a position to offer to the appreciation of the public, in the columns of that respected organ of the daily press of this city, a minute narrative from the diary which Lieutenant Marques de Souza himself had written, of all the facts that formed the history of that unfortunate expedition. It is unnecessary, therefore, to repeat here, in a simple and incomplete summary, the principal facts of that narrative, which will be engraved in the hearts of all Brazilians, with the bright colors of the picture with which we know how to perpetuate the memory of those of our compatriots who, dignifying and honoring human nature, incorporate themselves into the eternally glorious cohort of the heroes who personify the soul of our country. We can, thus, transport ourselves to other zones of the great wilderness which we are studying in these rapid notes. Let us therefore march to the south, without, however, deviating ourselves from the meridian in which are to be found the sources of the river Tenente Marques de Souza. Having journeyed not more than 2 leagues, we then cross the course of a new river, the Ike, and afterwards, successively, that of the Toloiri, the 12 de Outubro, the Nambicara, and the Camarare, known prior to the 1909 expedition and noted in the geographical charts as a tributary of the left bank of the Juruena, at the point corresponding to latitude 12 degrees 53 minutes 52 seconds and longitude 16 degrees 43 minutes 2 seconds. Since that year we recognized that another river, also discovered by us and crossed in latitude 12 degrees 54 minutes 14 seconds and longitude 16 degrees 31 minutes 55 seconds, flowed to the right into the said Camarare. We named it at the time Camararezino, or in the Parisí language Socamararesa, which it still maintains. With regard to the 4 previously mentioned, I remained at first in doubt as to whether the Nambicaras would be the tributary of the Camarare or of the 12 de Outubro, but I was always certain that the latter received on the left bank of the Ike, and before it the Toloiri. Anyhow, what immediately was self-evident was the preponderance of the 12 de Outubro, a river which descending from the opposite side to that of the principal headwaters of the Gy-Paraná, the already named Piroculuina, appeared to us to have its course independent not only of the basin of the said Gy, but also of that of the Juruena. Observing that the enormous space comprised between the meridians of 17 and 19 degrees and the parallels of 11 and 9 degrees, in which the chart of Pimenta Bueno and others more recent figure 4 headwaters of the Gy, which we have just verified do not exist, remained entirely empty, we formulated the hypothesis that along it should stretch the valley of a long river, of which our 12 de Outubro would only be the extreme meridional portion. Like every reasonable hypothesis, this one could and should be verified. In order to carry this out, I entrusted same to Lieutenant Julio Caetano Horta Barbosa, giving him as assistants the Inspector of Telegraphs, Francisco Mascarenas, Joaquim Sol, and 5 regional volunteers of the 5th Battalion of Engineers. The expedition left from the highest headwaters of the Ike and the surroundings of the portion of the telegraph line laid between Villena and Jose Bonifacio, at a point in which the river presented a width of 5 meters and an average depth of 15 centimeters, and a discharge per second of 2,222 liters. By the plan previously drawn out, the journey should be made by land along the river, up to the point where it should become favorable for navigation. But as the men for the axe-cutting work were not as numerous as this hard work exacted for the felling of trees in the virgin forest necessary in order to give passage to the pack animals, Lieutenant Julio Caetano was obliged to commence the transport by water before the Ike became navigable. Thus, in July 1912, the voyage commenced by land, and from August 4th onward was carried out partly in canoes and partly on foot; but immediately the possibility offered itself, the expedition embarked, and thus came out at the city of Santarém in Pará, having taken close on 5 months from the day on which they had interned themselves in the forest. The essential result of the expedition was to destroy the hypothesis which had been formulated with regard to the course of the 12 de Outubro. Because the Ike, after receiving the waters of a few rivers, inclined itself still further towards the east, and thus flowed until it met it. A little after this union, the 12 de Outubro entered into the Camararé, whence its waters are taken to the Juruena-Tapajóz, and therefore to the Amazon. If we now wish to have an idea of the enormous amount of energy which had to be displayed by the young officer of our army to conduct to a good end this formidable campaign of 5 months of struggle against the brutal resistance of the hard and threatening nature of the wilderness through which he had to take his men, we will proceed to read a few topics of the report which he himself made on the march of his expedition. After telling you how he constructed his first 2 canoes on the banks of the Ike, both of cedar wood, with a length of little less than 10 meters, and a width of, the first 50 centimeters and the other 40, he says, "Right in the first days I verified that of the advantages with which I had counted, descending the river embarked, only one remained to me, which, however, justified by itself alone the resolution which I took, the facility of transportation. The progress of the work continued to be very small, and it even happened that we came down to 350 meters of advancement in a whole day of tireless effort. The work of the axe did not diminish, and on the contrary, it became more hard, because it had to be carried out mostly in water. The river extraordinarily blocked with very sharp curves, afforded with difficulty a passage for the canoes, and numerous waterfalls obliged us almost daily to discharge the baggage and transport same on our shoulders below the rapids, retarding our journey and making it still more troublesome. At the waterfall we had to pass the canoes by hand, now over the stones, now over rollers, and even at times we had to take them out of the water. These obstacles alone, quite natural to the service which I was commencing, but which I had not foreseen due to want of experience, justify that working all day long with the greatest effort, we did not attain an average of 1 kilometer per day during the first month of the service. Besides this, sickness and accidents cropped up. On the 18th of August, I had one of my workmen inutilized, as he had wounded the big toe of his right foot with a stroke of the axe, which almost severed it in 2, it being necessary to amputate it, which I had done with a Gillette blade for the want of a better instrument. Before the wound healed, another man suffered the same mishap. The most serious was, however, that which occurred on the 22nd of September, the victim being a man who was cutting a palmito for our evening meal, and he did this so unfortunately that he was knocked down by the palm tree, which caused internal ruptures, of which he died 6 days afterwards, that is, on the 28th of September. Carrying this unfortunate companion of toil with every care it was possible to bestow upon him in the situation in which we found ourselves, we buried him at the spot where he died, and over his grave we placed a cross with an inscription. Our party therefore became reduced to 7 men including myself, and of the workmen only one, the regional volunteer, Manuel Pedro Gonsalves, was well." Now let us see a few parts of the description which Lieutenant Julio Caetano makes of the natural aspects of the river explored. "The Ike," he says, "flows in the wood for 20 kilometers, where the Campos Indigenas commence to appear, on the right firstly. At 27 kilometers they occur also on the left. These camps sometimes depart from, and sometimes approach the banks, scarcely ever meeting the river. Its bed is stony all along, and the banks, now firmes, now marshy, are abundant with palm trees, principally Anaha, Buriti, Uracuri, Tucum, Patois, Asahi, Bacaba, Pacheuba, etc., according to the nature of the soil. It is poor in rubber trees. We met, however, with a few here and there. But there are sufficient cedar, guanandi, favero, jatoba, pau Brazil, suviera, etc. On its banks salsa parrilla and a lot of canganga are to be found. The campos indigenas extend downstream, and crossing same at nearly 24 kilometers, we came across a cerrado extending out of sight." After referring to various important features of the river, affluents, waterfalls, and rapids, whose technical elements were conveniently noted, and the occurrences of the voyage, such as shipwreck, loss of baggage and food, and also of one of the canoes, Lieutenant Julio Caetano gives an account in the following words of the entrance of the Ike into the Camararé, and of the latter into the Juruena. "At 227 kilometers from the point of embarkation, the Ike, having then almost 30 meters width, discharges its waters into the 12 de Outubro, which has from 80 to 100 meters width, and flows in the direction of 60 degrees southwest. Following same, 1800 meters below is to be found the river Camararé, which has approximately 120 meters of width, and comes in the direction of 90 degrees west. Here commence the large forests of Indians, which follow the whole course of the river up to the Juruena, and is to be found 267,400 meters away from the point of our departure." In order to finish these rapid allusions to the voyage of reconnaissance of the Ike, we shall still transcribe a topic of the report made by Lieutenant Julio Caetano, treating of the Indian inhabitants of all the explored region. "On the 31st of October, date of our arrival at the Juruena, we had the pleasure of meeting the Nhambiquara Indians. It was about 9:30 a.m. when we heard in the woods the noise of people throwing themselves off the trees and running. I immediately ordered the canoe to be moored to the opposite bank. We shouted to the Indians, showing them axes, beads, and cotton thread. Soon 2 of them appeared, and I called them up, showing them the presents. At first they hesitated, but afterwards they crossed the river and came to meet us. The pleasure which we all felt at meeting the Nhambiquaras is indescribable. They seemed to us as friends expected after a long absence. The joy they showed at meeting us was not less than ours. They told us that they had come from afar, and that they were going to Campos Novos. In order to cross the river, one of them placed under his arms 2 thin floaters made out of the burity palm, while the other, attaching himself firmly to the feet of the former, was towed by him to the place where we were. We afterwards crossed over, taking one in our canoe; the other swam clinging to her bows. On the bank where they were at first, then appeared other Indians, men and women, who gave us tobacco, honey, and necklaces in exchange for what we had given them. When we proceeded on our navigation, one of the latter followed us along the woods, advising others of our approach. A little lower down, where we halted for breakfast, others came to meet us, a man with his wife and a youth, and further down still we met others. To all of them I distributed presents." From the summary of the narrative above described, it can be inferred that, if a person should leave from the Madeira into the interior of the woods, ascending the course of the Gy-Paraná or of the Roosevelt, with the decision to reach the most easterly headwaters of any one of these rivers, he would finally arrive at the meridian of 17 degrees, between parallels 13 degrees and 12 degrees, and could even cross it a few minutes further east. However, once he should have arrived there, however little he should advance further east, he would immediately commence to find waters taking the courses inscribed in the quadrant of northeast. The basin of the Madeira would therefore be ended and that of the Tapajóz commenced. As a line of division of the 2 basins, we can take the meridian of the Vilhena station, which is the same as that of Villa Bea. If the explorer should wish to proceed on his journey from this point, by descending as far as the Juruena, and then departing from its right bank, as much as might be necessary in order to attain the farthest point of all those which mark the headwaters of the eastern catchment of the basement of the Tapajóz, he would see his wish satisfied only when, Having come to the end of a journey of approximately 1,000 kilometers, he would arrive in the vicinity of the spot whence the Xingu emanates. The fact is that the Tapajóz is like a prodigious vine, whose trunk advances into the interior of the lands from a point before the parallel of 3 degrees up to a spot more than halfway between those of 14 degrees and of 15 degrees, throwing off to one and the other side powerful branches, some extending beyond the meridian of 16 degrees, and others, longer, more numerous, and stronger, which, from the opposite side, almost succeed in touching on the meridian of 11 degrees. If we consider the enormous area invaded and covered by the network generated by these branches, which in their turn also divide and subdivide themselves into branches and sub-branches, and if we remember that in them the movement of the water occurs in a contrary sense to that which occurs in the real vines, we shall see that the Tapajóz, as a collector of the feeders of so vast a region, must necessarily assume that status full of majesty which assures to it a distinguished place among the largest rivers of the world. This majesty, if it contributed to consolidate the fame which, since colonial days, is attributed to the name of the great tributary of the Amazon, it was not, however, a sufficient stimulus for some of those enterprising spirits who have devoted themselves to the study of the geography of our country to decide to carry out a scientific exploration of the whole of its course. The Telegraph Lines Commission was to bear the brunt of making up for such a failing, not only in regard to the Tapajóz itself, but also in respect to its most important tributaries of the right bank. For a realization of the first part of the program, a scientific expedition was organized in 1911 under the direction of Captain Manuel Teófilo de Costa Pinheiro, assisted by the botanist Frederick Owen, and Dr. Murillo de Campos. On the 28th of December, having terminated the necessary preparations for the voyage, the members of the expedition, 14 in number, took their places in 5 canoes, and commenced to descend the Juruena, leaving the place where it is cut by the telegraph line track, a spot which we reached for the first time in 1907, and since 1908 we have occupied with a military detachment. Alas, how many deep modifications had taken place in this corner of the great wilderness, which, in those years, we had found immerged in the most absolute and hostile savagery. The same inhabitants of those then mysterious lonesome spots, who had received us in warlike attitude and so ignorantly repelled into audacious assaults the friendship which we offered them, are now here represented by a group of the so-called Cocoses, who had come to assist in the last arrangements of our expeditionary column. They are no longer the hard warriors of those days, but yes, trusting friends who were desirous of participating in the risks and the dangers which we were about to face for the first time in the descent of this famous river, whose access they had formerly defended with such staunch bravery. Unfortunately, the total absence of accommodation of which the small craft was suffering, already excessively overcharged with quantities of baggage, provisions, implements, and engineering instruments, obliged us to refuse the request which they made to accompany us. Afterwards, already on the voyage, the members of the expedition had further occasion of finding themselves in the midst of other groups of the formerly so much feared Nhambiquara nation. "Every now and again," says Captain Costa Pinheiro in his report on this expedition, "on both banks of the river we noticed large openings in the woods, which indicated their plantations to us; landing stages on both sides of the river corresponding to one another; primitive rafts, bundles of burity palm leaves bound together, on which they used to cross from one side of the river to the other; finally we even found their war implements. On the 31st of December, a little before midday, I was at the mouth of the Juruena, taking observations from the sun, when I heard on the opposite bank some yells. I listened attentively, and distinguished the word Anawe repeated incessantly. There was no doubt they were Nhambiquaras. We all went to the bank of the river and saw some of them, completely naked, always crying out Anaway and showing us corn cobs. Perfectly understanding their intention towards us, I manned a canoe and sent it to the other bank. As the canoe drew near, some of them hid in the woods, but 4 of them came to receive us, handing us some corn cobs. In retribution of this, we gave them some hatchets, the sole gifts which we had with us. They were extremely satisfied." Besides the Nhambiquaras, Captain Pinheiro also referred to the Apiacas. It is as well to read out some passages of what the distinguished officer had to say at the time, in order that we may lift a little of the edge of the veil which hides from our sight the most inner localities of the territory of our country. "Of the Apiacas," writes Captain Pinheiro, "whom we were sure we would meet in the Salto Augusto, we could not even see traces. In short, only at the revenue office of Mato Grosso, at São Manoel, did we succeed in meeting the first Apiacas, already then almost civilized. It was in talking with the Mato Grosso tax collector and other persons of the locality that I came to learn how the Apiaca Indians had disappeared from Salto Augusto and other points up the São Manoel. The revenue office of Mato Grosso was established in 1902. The first collector was Mr. Tomás Carneiro, who commenced his administration by entering immediately into a quarrel with the Apiacas, and persecuted them cruelly. So many were the punishments and ill treatments inflicted on the Indians, not only by himself but also by his brother Ernesto Carneiro, commander of the detachment of police, that their revenge was not long in coming. With the intention of taking a just revenge, the Apiacas assembled one day in the neighbourhood of this place, and in the dead of night, without being suspected, penetrated into the revenue office and killed the collector and his brother. In order to take the place of Mr. Tomás Carneiro, Mr. Fabio Ferrer was appointed, and the latter continued with a series of persecutions against the Indians, stating that he wished in this way to avenge the death of his predecessor. Once he caused the Apiacas to be invited to take coffee. The Indians, in good faith, while rather suspicious, accepted the invitation, and when they were in the barracão (store), taking that beverage, Mr. Ferrer, availing himself of the detachment at the service of the revenue office, which had been previously equipped and prepared, ordered them to fire, thus killing nearly all of them. A woman was the only survivor. To this day, anyone going to the revenue office can see, right in front of a barracão (store), which once served as the barracks, the place where they were all buried in one grave. After this feat, Mr. Ferrer assembled nearly 100 men, between rubber tappers and the personnel of the revenue office, and conducted an assault against an old maloca which existed at the old Cachoeira de São Florencio. The assault took place very early when the Apiacas were yet inside their maloca, and as the Indians, frightened by the fire, came running out gesticulating and crying out exclamations, they were received with shots. Few of them escaped. To this day, whoever may pass by the Cachoeira de São Florencio can see, already faded, the signs of this work of dismantlement and destruction. Mr. Fabio Ferrer was substituted by Mr. Antonio Gomez de Lima, who remained there for about 3 years, having been considered by all as a good tax collector. He was substituted by Mr. Paulo Correa, who continued the persecution of the Apiacas and committed all sorts of violence against the rubber tappers. He prohibited, in an irrevocable manner, the Apiacas from descending the river so far as São Manoel. Those who transgressed his orders were severely punished. Finally, the persecutions against the Apiacas and the rubber tappers assumed such proportions that one day Mr. Paulo Correa was assassinated by his own followers. He was substituted by Mr. Sotero Barreto, who re-established normal conditions, and inaugurated an era of peace and prosperity for the revenue station. As it is easy to surmise, the Apiacas, pressed hard, persecuted, and subject to the violent treatment of the civilized people, interned themselves into the forests and abandoned the banks of the Juruena. The few of them who remained nearer, in contact with the rubber tappers, returned to the revenue station and are now there up to this day, content with the protection which is offered them by the collector. When I went by there, at the end of February of the current year, that is to say of 1912, there were at the revenue station 32 Apiaca Indians, composed of 16 women, 7 men, and 9 children." As we can infer from these words of Captain Pinheiro, the persecutions and violent treatment used against the undefended Apiacas by various public officials of the state of Mato Grosso on the Tapajóz transposed the limits of the most wanton barbarity and the hardest cruelty. But however dark this picture may appear to us, it is well to know that it is yet wanting in many other tones, no less tetrical than the former, beginning with the baseness of the intentions which prompted the revenue collector Paulo Correa and his predecessors to commit such violence and atrocity. The purpose was to rob the Indians of their wives. Besides the Apiacas, the expedition for the study of the Tapajóz also met the Mundurucus, some of whose villages were built at the mouth of the São Tomé. Others, and in the majority, exist on the river Cururu, extending along the camps called Capepi Uat. They live there on the resources which they are able to provide by means of their small plantations, assisted with the elements they obtain out of their magnificent forests. The actual number of these Indians is estimated at about 2,000 souls, the male portion being considerably greater than the female. In the settlements of the Capepi Uat, the Franciscan friars, Hugo and Luis Meus, have just built a small chapel, covered with pindoba leaves. The two priests, however, were not present at the time that the botanist Hoen and Dr. Murillo de Campos visited the place. We can resume the other work done by the expedition under Captain Pinheiro by stating that it effected the rapid survey of the river, from the telegraph station of Juruena up to São Manoel. It calculated the discharge of the principal tributaries. It determined the altitude of the different points of greater importance, as also the coordinates of the mouths of the Juruena, Camararé, Papagaio, Sangue, and Arinos, of the famous and beautiful Salto Augusto, and of the mouth of the São Manoel, a river which had become celebrated in the chronicles of the expeditions for the study of the territory of our country, by the sad fact of the tragic death of Captain Telles Pires, who, in 1889, had undertaken to explore it, accompanied by a friend and distinguished companion, the engineer of our army, Oscar de Miranda. As a just but tardy homage to the illustrious memory of this unfortunate officer, who lost his life in the midst of the hard work which he had commenced and with which he was proceeding, animated only by the thought and the desire of contributing to the aggrandizement of his beloved country, I submit to the appreciation of the Brazilian geographers the idea of naming this river Captain Telles Pires. And as sad fatality had fixed forever the ties which friendship and good comradeship had established between this officer and his illustrious companion of work and of suffering, associating the two names so intimately that it is not now possible for any one to remember one without immediately having the other before him, I propose further that the waterfall where the sad shipwreck took place be called after the name of Oscar de Miranda. The future of this modest remembrance, but most sincere and still more merited homage, would certainly be very precarious if in order to help it and recommend it to the appreciation of my co-citizens, one should not have to count with the resolution of the wish of a worthy collectivity generally respected in the circles in which it should have to be launched and cultivated until it produced the fruits expected of it. Fortunately, however, We others, admirers of the names of which we intend to make a cult, can appeal to the Geographical Society of Rio de Janeiro, asking it to adopt as its own this double proposal, and to protect it with the same kindness and fervor which it dispensed to the organization of that bold undertaking, born of the civic enthusiasm which, in the years nearest to the advent of the Republic, inflamed the souls of the youth of our army and irradiated from same, causing to spring up associations of such beauty as that of the triumvirate formed by Captain Telles Pires with the lieutenants, which they were at that period, Oscar de Miranda and Jimeno Villeroy. Full of hope that the support asked for will not fail us, and convinced that it, once at large, will immediately secure the victory which is desired, we shall no longer refer to the feeder of the Tapajóz under any other name than the river Capitão Telles Pires. Another important result of Costa Pinheiro's expedition has yet to be considered by us in regard to the mouth of this river, and the comparison of its volume with that of the Arinos and of the Juruena. The first discoverers of the Tapajóz and its immediate navigators considered it as being formed from part of the trunk comprised from the mouth, in the Amazon, up to a point in which this trunk divides itself into two branches, one which continues in the general direction of the previous course, and the other whose bed one sees laying in a sense most accentuatedly deviated to the east. To this last, in olden times, the denomination of Tres Barras, or São Manoel, was given. This is our Telles Pires. The other received the name of Juruena, and with it continued as far as the upper headwaters in the Chapadao Plateau dos Parecis. The dwellers on the banks of the Tapajóz, consulted by Captain Costa Pinheiro, still conserve this tradition. For them, the Tapajóz commences at the confluence of the Juruena with the Telles Pires. The modern geographers, however, accepted Pimenta Bueno's theory, published in his map of Mato Grosso, which consists in making the name of Juruena die at the mouth of the Arinos, the Tapajóz therefore figuring as the result of the concourse of the waters which descend united from that mouth as far as the Amazon. A similar modification, which contradicts the historic tradition to be found in the chronicles of the two past centuries, and the indications of a riparian population and of all the navigators, ancient and modern, are not supported by any reason of an order superior to these elements. At the point in which the Juruena receives the Arinos, Captain Pinheiro verified its discharge to be 1,975 cubic meters, its bed having a width of 1,080 meters. The measurements did not give, for the discharge of the Arinos, more than 1,283 meters and the width of 734 meters. Comparing these elements, it is easily seen that there is no reason for these two rivers to be considered there equal to one another. The power of one does not present itself in conditions to be utilized by the other so as to give place to the appearance of a new geographical feature, exacting also a new name. The direction which the Juruena took continues from there downstream. The volume is superior to that of the Arinos. Therefore, it is perfectly plausible to consider this as a tributary of the other, which name should be conserved and prolonged at least as far as the mouth of the Telles Pires. The Tapajóz is therefore formed by the union of the waters of the old São Manoel with those of the Juruena. The first contributes, in each second, for its formation, with a volume of 1,747 meters cube, and the second with that of 2,489. In accordance with these conclusions, the real course of the river studied by Captain Costa Pinheiro, the Anauina of the Parecis, will have an extension of almost 1,000 kilometers, of which the first 207, which go from the headwaters in the Sierra dos Parecis, close to the sources of the Guaporé, as far as the telegraph station in latitude of south 12 degrees 50 minutes 31.4 seconds, and longitude west of Rio de Janeiro 15 degrees 44 minutes 50.4 seconds, have not yet been surveyed or traversed. In the section of 792,872 meters explored by Captain Pinheiro's expedition, the Juruena receives through its right bank successively, from above to below, the rivers Papagaio, Sangue, and Arinos. Each one of these affluents constitutes a central collector of a secondary basin, sufficiently remarkable, whose complete description can only be made after terminating, during the current year, the conjoint efforts which in this connection the Telegraph Lines Commission developed. With regard to the first of these collectors, the Papagaio, or the Saruina, the principal headwaters rise in latitude 14 degrees 30 minutes, and in longitude 15 degrees 50 minutes, where it runs in a contrary direction to the most northerly branch of the Jauru. We saw how the reconnaissance of the part of its course, which was yet to be studied below the station of REIDY, was effected in 1914 by the Lauriodo-Fiala party of the Roosevelt-Rondon scientific expedition. On the left, and after the station of Udiarity, the Papagaio receives the Buriti, and immediately afterwards the Saué-Uina, or the river Maracana, with regard to which we had made the mistake in saying in the geographical conclusions of the volume already published of our report on the studies and reconnaissances, that it was the direct affluent of the Juruena. The correction which I leave here consigned is a result of the work of the above-mentioned Lauriodo-Fiala expedition. On the right, the river Papagaio receives, after the station of Udiarity, but before the mouth of the Buriti, the river Sacre, or Timalatia, which comes to it engrossed by its feeder, the river Verde, or as the Parecis call it, the Tarhuruina. This affluent of the Sacre marks the eastern limit of the sub-basin of the Papagaio. It did not figure in any geographical chart before the work of the Telegraph Lines Commission, and must also not be mistaken for the Agua Verde, or the Ananaz, feeder to the Arinos, which was erroneously inscribed by Father Badariot in the sketch of a chart which accompanied his memorial entitled The Expedition of the North of Mato Grosso, 1898, as one of the feeders of the Jacuruina, giving it the name of River Verde. The river Curavari, or Cucuruinasa, which in the geographical conclusions of my alluded report is described as an affluent of the right bank of the Sacre, was subsequently recognized by us as belonging to the second of the above-mentioned sub-basins tributaries to the Juruena. This sub-basin has as its principal collector the river Sangue, or Sutia Haruina, which, before taking the waters of the Cravari, received through its opposite bank, that is to say, by the right of the Sakuruina, a river to which the old charts referred under the name of Xacuruina, inscribing it before Pimenta Bueno as the tributary of the Arinos. Ricardo Franco himself was undecided on the face of the diverging information, which he obtained on Same, of which some gave it as an affluent of the Juruena, and others as of the Arinos, where he would arrive by means of the Sumiduro. End of section 22.
Section 23 of the Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition and the Telegraph Line Commission. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition and the Telegraph Line Commission by Candido Rondon, translated by R.G. REIDY and Edwin Murray. Third Lecture, Part 10. The reconnaissance of the river Sangue was effected by Lieutenant Vicente de Paula Vasconcelos, assisted by Dr. Serapion. For this purpose, an exploring expedition was formed, which left on the 10th of May of the current year, from the point where the telegraph line crossed that river, descended it, embarked in 2 canoes as far as its mouth, in the Juruena, where he arrived on the last day of the following month. The total course run in these 71 days traveling consisted of 425,400 meters, as set out by the topographical survey obtained with the assistance of a telemeter. By these figures one can see that the result of navigation did not attain per day an average of 9 kilometers, and this figure is, by itself, sufficiently eloquent to dispense us of here enumerating the series of obstacles which had to be overcome by Lieutenant Vasconcelos, amongst which are a number of rapids and 2 important falls, beyond the inevitable accidents of shipwreck and loss of craft. The measurements gave for the discharge of the river studied, at the point of embarkation, a volume of 118 cubic meters, and at its mouth more than 360. With regard to the mouths of the 2 principal affluents, Lieutenant Vasconcelos arrived at that of the Sacuriú-Iná on the 6th of June, a little more than 100 kilometers from Passo da Linha, and that of the Cravari 6 days afterwards, at 139 kilometers below the previous one. The discharge of the first river was, at the time, 59 cubic meters, through a mouth of 49 meters wide. That of the second was 101 cubic meters, with a width of 52 meters. The most important incident of all was the meeting of Lieutenant Vasconcelos with a few groups of Indians of the tribe living in the lower portion of the course of the river Sangue. Only after having passed the mouth of the Sacuriú-Iná had the distinguished officer the opportunity of verifying that the river was inhabited. In order to remain more faithful to the exposition of these interesting episodes, I will here read the topics in which that officer refers to them in his report on this voyage. On the 9th of June, he says, an important note offered itself to us. We saw the first Indian. In a loop of the river, sitting on a dry tree, fallen over towards the bank of the river, there he was, with his arrow in hand, amusing himself fishing. I had not the pleasure of seeing him, not even from afar off, because with the noise which our craft made, and the shouts of Antonio Correia, the prowman of the siding canoe crying out to call my attention, he was disturbed, and turned himself swiftly into the woods. At the point where he was seen, I landed. I beat about the bush, but saw nothing except a few sticks broken here and there. A little before, we found an old resting place of the Indians whose stakes had been cut with a blunt knife. On the following day, we saw a cluster of woods, also old, the trees of which had been cut with a stone axe. This was the first encounter noted by Lieutenant Vasconcelos, even before that of the Cravari. But after passing the mouth of this river, another one took place, which is told by that officer in the following words. The signs of Indians, limited until then almost exclusively to the encounter of the fishermen, were becoming more frequent and more recent, and we noted that all of them used our implements. On the 19th, we bivouacked on the right bank in a large and not very old camp belonging to them, and where they passed some time occupied in hunting and fishing, for behind the bank and to a great extent there is a lagoon, most certainly rich in fish and wild ducks, of which we saw various specimens. We were, in fact, not far from the Indians, and the most interesting episode of the whole expedition was about to commence on the following day, in which we camped on the left bank at almost 317 kilometers from Passo da Linha and 108 from the Juruena, well in front of a largely inhabited village overlooking the river on the top of a small hill. We had effected 12 kilometers of survey when those in the sighting canoe were aroused by shouts and laughter coming from the Indians, who further down were amusing themselves bathing. We proceeded to the front one more station in order to get closer up. We interrupted the work we were doing, and pronouncing some Nhambiquara words, which occurred to us at the time, we went on rowing down with the intention of selecting a spot suitable for our bivouac, inasmuch as our desire was then entirely to enter into friendly relationship with those poor people. We were very fortunate in our purpose, for as we effected our crossing over to the left bank, we immediately caught sight of a clearing on that bank, in front of the landing stage of the Maloca, and where the Indians were still amusing themselves. Taken unawares, and not suspecting an importune visit, above all coming by water, and still more from upstream, they never even noticed that we were near them. We announced our presence. As soon as they heard our first yell, they naturally saw our canoes and became absolutely silent. If it were not for the smoke which came from the Maloca and rose above the wood, and still more the thatched roof of the hut, which could only be seen from afar through the coping of the cluster of trees, no one passing by that spot at that moment would suppose that below each tree a human heart was throbbing. Having terminated the first work of the installation of our camp, I took a canoe manned by 3 men, and we went to make a small reconnaissance downstream, with the intention, above all, of ascertaining as to whether we could get a better view of the hut. We had descended a little more or less 150 meters, when we saw on the surface of the waters, hugging the right bank, at a small landing stage, a ubá, which was flooded. We directed ourselves to this spot, in order to examine more carefully this primitive craft used by the Indians, and which consists of a big piece of the bark of a tree, the extremities being turned up to form the bow and the stern. A few stays of wood across same in its width in order to avoid the bark doubling to, and nothing more. It is in fact perfectly identical to those used by the Parnawats. Having made this short examination of the ubá, and as we verified that the Maloca was entirely hidden by the trees, we decided to go upstream, hugging the right bank, to see whether we could discover something new. The canoemen had scarcely given their first strokes to their paddles, when behold, 2 arrows whistled past our ears, one after the other. Fortunately, they missed their mark and were lost in the river. The fright which we underwent was not small, and I believe that the canoemen never paddled so quickly, so much that they almost swamped the canoe, which being very heavily laden, did not respond to the haste which we had to gain the opposite bank. Those who had remained in the bivouac, and who had not lost sight of us in that evolution, were observing everything, and became alarmed, but they could see that the arrows had passed over our heads without hitting us. On arriving at the bivouac, we left for our canoes, and recommenced our shouts. The reply obtained, however, was always the same: silence. We then resolved to make a new attempt. This time we would go to their landing stage opposite ours, and there we would leave axes and short swords, for by this means they would see that our intentions were still pacific, in spite of the attack which we had suffered, and that they had nothing to fear from us. We took these with us, and directed ourselves carefully towards the bank of the river. Still on this occasion we were not well received. On approaching the landing stage, 2 more arrows were shot at us. Fortunately, like the first ones, they missed their target. We returned hastily to our bivouac, without having succeeded once again to collect the arrows, which were immediately carried away by the current. Some moments after this second unsuccessful attempt, the Indians allowed themselves to be finally seen at various points on the bank of the river, richly adorned, with their feather garments of many colors, amongst which predominated those of the Araras. They were armed with bows and handfuls of arrows, and yelled out similarly to the shouts which had used to call them, imitating us perfectly. We immediately directed ourselves to the landing stage. From the canoes we replied to the yells of the Indians, and in a very short space of time we became familiarized and laughed together, mocking each other, imitating the song and chirps of well-known birds. In a short time we were, both parties, in frank conversation, in which one repeated what the other said, and nobody understood the other. As this was going on, one could hear in the Maloca a nasal chant of many voices, accompanied by regular stamping of feet and the sounds of some primitive instrument. Of all this show, and having in view the previous occurrences, we concluded that that was a war chant, notwithstanding the gentle manner with which some, and above all one, which we supposed to be the chief, endeavored to imitate what we said. However, a few moments having passed, he who appeared to us to be the chief, having beside him a woman, took a few steps in front of the group which encircled him, and arriving as far as the brink of the river, where he remained entirely uncovered, presented us with his son, a boy of from 4 to 5 years of age, holding him by his wrists and lifting him up from the ground several times. We were delighted with that jest, interpreting it as being a promise of firm peace, and we immediately took to the canoe. We approximated ourselves little by little. Whilst we were maneuvering and paddling, we showed them the axes and the swords without interrupting the conversation which both parties were holding most enthusiastically. We did not lose their slightest movement, at least that which we could devise, because in spite of everything we did, as soon as we got into the canoes, retired a little behind the trees. We were about 30 meters from them when they again aimed and shot off their arrows. As on previous occasions, we maneuvered as quickly as possible, turning our canoes towards our bivouac. On this occasion, the arrows shot off were 4 in number, of which we were able to get 1. In view of these happenings, we found it prudent to attempt nothing further on that day. We therefore agreed to let the following day pass, to see whether we would be more fortunate later on. Now dusk was falling, and we could do nothing better than contemplate them through our field glasses. They are good-looking men and strongly built. I think there is no doubt that they are Nhambiquaras. They use arrows like theirs, with the difference that the directing feathers are disposed in the form of a screw. The men are decked for their defense and dress with hangings made out of fiber. The women carry nothing more than necklaces and bracelets, which are also used by the men. They paint themselves. One I saw with 3 lines of white and black dye on his wrists, and another had his face all smeared with white. We counted in all 12 men, perfectly armed and adorned. We only saw 1 Indian woman, the one that accompanied her husband when he presented us with the boy. She was young, beautiful, a good figure and tall. The others, the old women and the children, formed a chorus, which we could hear. We also observed a small plantation, close to the Maloca, for we distinguished between the openings and the copings of the trees and above the hill, banana trees and the foliage of the manioc plant. Of the hut we could see nothing, not even the shape. The project of remaining in the bivouac of the village on the 21st for the exclusive purpose of establishing friendly relations with these poor people was only a hope. After the 3rd and last attempt, they became still more amiable. They repeated what we said and laughed heartily. They went to fetch a shirt with which they dressed the boy, and with a sword, the same as ours, opened a small landing place, cutting the branches which descended almost to the surface of the water, and there they stretched out a net. We thought that they wished to please us, showing us articles which had belonged to us. However, they were up to a new stratagem, destined to distract us and inspire us with confidence. And the proof of this we had on the morning of the 21st. During the night they crossed over to our side, using for this purpose an ubá, and completely enveloped us, awaiting for the dawn of the next day in order to open the attack. As usual, at 5 a.m. we commenced work. We directed ourselves to the canoes, and cried out, calling various times, but in vain. We thought that they were still asleep, owing to the cold weather and to the darkness and mist which was falling. Withal, we did not fail to take notice of their silence, which caused us suspicion. Far from us was it to be supposed that we were surrounded by them. We returned under cover and made coffee. At this moment, behold, there fell upon us from all sides a regular shower of arrows, accompanied by the loud noise of their voices and the helter-skelter of the Indians closing in upon us rapidly with their sure shots. Attacked in this way, almost unawares, we were not a little upset. My personnel, frightened, ran to take cover where I was, yelling, Indians! Arrows! I immediately got out of cover, having previously got hold of my shotgun, which I had with me, ordering them not to run and telling them to fire into the air. I myself fired the first shot, and it was this that saved us. The personnel, with fright and the recommendations which I had given not to fire, had dropped their arms. With the report of the gun, the Indians got frightened and ran, and more or less calm was then re-established amongst us. It was a pity that the effect of this occurrence did not only remain in the fright which we had passed. 2 men were wounded, one slightly, Antonio Correia, struck in the vertebral column below the neck, where the arrow penetrated only 3 or 4 millimeters. The other, unfortunately, received a more serious wound. This was Marcelino Borges, who, poor fellow, had no luck during expedition. He was bitten by a snake. He was shipwrecked while still ill, and lastly received this arrow, which struck him in the thigh, piercing it as far as the iliac region. He remained a very short time standing, owing to the pain and abundant hemorrhage. Dr. Serapion did the necessary dressings which both cases exacted. In view of the attitude of the Indians and bearing in mind our position, we decided to break down the camp without loss of time and to proceed on the topographical service. While the necessary dressing was being done and the canoes were being loaded, we made a small inspection of the surroundings, verifying the position occupied by the assailants on the occasion of the attack. We then saw that they were short of entering the small area of our bivouac, for the line of attack arrived at less than 30 meters from our tents. Some of them, frightened at the shots, dropped their arrows and one of them also his bow. These were collected by us, many others being lost in the river. The plan of attack was well conceived. Above, below, and from one of the sides, they placed themselves frankly resolved to annihilate us. On the other side was the river. In case anyone wished to escape by saying, he could not go very far, because above and below there were groups of warriors, as well as on the opposite bank, where it would be madness to procure refuge. The banks were therefore protected. No one could consequently get close to them without risking his life. We remained, therefore, deprived of proceeding with a survey with the telemeter. He had to use, in order to calculate our distances, the speed of our canoes. I sent the ferry raft down with the sick man, and following it, the sighting canoe, whilst I went upstream with mine as far as the point at which we had left service on the previous day, where we recommenced the survey. The Indians gave no further signs of themselves. They let the 2 canoes pass by. But when our turn came, on facing the mouth of a small igarapé, existing a few meters below the bivouac, they fired a shower of arrows over us. We then saw at this point, and close up to the opening produced by the bar of the igarapé, the group which had attacked us, also the ubá. In order to calm the crew of the canoe, and above all to avoid that some of them, frightened, should throw themselves into the water, I was obliged to fire 2 shots into the air. The Indians, with this, did not seem to worry themselves very much. They commenced to mock our exclamations, calling us and laughing heartily at our situation. For safety's sake, we carried out this work midstream by means of the velocity, and thus continued for 8 kilometers, at the end of which we found an island to which we moored. We then met together and reorganized our march to continue from there with the survey by telemeters. Before abandoning the camp of the village, we left, as a token of our farewell, some axes and swords, placed on a small platform. From the narrative of this interesting episode, in which one can see at the same time a striking example of the methods and procedure adopted by the Telegraph Lines Commission in the relations with the indigenous tribes, found in the wilds in which it had to operate, and the calm and resolute courage of the officer who directed the action, impressing it with a seal of such high chivalry, it must be inferred that Lieutenant Vasconcelos supposed that the Indians of the lower course of the river Sangue belonged to the Gy-Paraná nation. Such a supposition, however, must be rejected, not only from the fact that Lieutenant Vasconcelos himself had not heard from those Indians a single word of the Nhambiquara vocabulary, as also, and principally by the verification that the Indians in question possessed habits and customs which absolutely do not coincide with those of our known dwellers of the zone comprised between the Juruena, the Comemoração de Floriano, and the headwaters of the Roosevelt. Besides the difference noted in the course of the narrative with regard to the manner of placing the directing feathers for the flight of the arrows, there is yet that which results from the use of the net and of the practice of navigation. It is already known that the Nhambiquaras lay themselves down to sleep directly on the ground, without any other care than that of selecting for this purpose places covered with sand, and that for their transports by water, which are limited to simple passing from one bank to the other of the rivers, they use nothing more than some floaters made out of the buriti palm, with which they help their swimming. Contrary to this, the dwellers of the river Sangue sleep in hammocks, which they must necessarily make themselves, and furthermore they know how to build ubás and to utilize them. From this last feature we are led to believe that they belong to the ethnographic group of the Tupis, and possess, as it is known, a civilization much more advanced than the Gés. We cannot at present determine the tribe from which these may have separated, neither the epoch in which this may have taken place, but we are certain that with them occurred the same thing as with the Parnawás, who are part of the old Tupi tribe which, in times gone by, interned itself in the wilderness occupied by nations of another origin, and there settled and held itself aloof from the other people belonging to an entirely different civilization to theirs. To many other facts of great geographic importance contained in the report of Lieutenant Vasconcelos on the valley of the river Sangue, I will not refer on this occasion for absolute want of time. I will only mention that, from the collection of the samples of rocks brought from there by this officer, the geologist Dr. Eusébio de Oliveira, who has studied same, concluded that the arenetic formation of the Plateau dos Parecis rests before the mouth of the river in question on crystalline and eruptive rocks. End of section 23. Section 24 of the Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition and the Telegraph Line Commission. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition and the Telegraph Line Commission by Candido Rondon, translated by R.G. REIDY and Edwin Murray. Third lecture, part 11. In order to terminate the description of the eastern watershed of the basin of the Juruena, there only remains for us to consider the Arinos and its tributaries. It is a well-known fact that since the colonial days, the navigation of this river was studied, in the hope of utilizing it, together with the Tapajóz, as a means of establishing direct communication between Mato Grosso and Pará. The first attempt was made in 1746 by the Sargento-Mor João de Souza Azevedo, who, having ascended the Paraguay and afterwards the Sepotuba, portaged his canoes by land until he arrived at a river to which he gave the name of Sumidouro, owing to the fact that a portion of its respective bed had sunk beneath a mound of a width of 3 kilometers. From the upper part of this tunnel, the intrepid Portuguese explorer let loose his canoes with wide borders at the discretion of the current, by which they were carried, and caused them to appear intact, according to the statement of Ricardo Franco, on the other side of the mound. From there, Souza Azevedo continued to descend the Sumidouro, which took him to the Arinos, and this river led him to the Juruena and to the Tapajóz, whence he penetrated into the Amazon and arrived at Belém do Pará. But the difficulties offered to navigation in the section of the Tapajóz where the waterfalls exist are of such importance that Souza Azevedo did not attempt to return by the same way, and in order to return from Belém to Mato Grosso, he preferred the longer route by the Amazon, Madeira, and Guaporé. The Corporal Manuel Gomes de Souza, in 1805, instructed by the governor Alves Menezes, effected for the second time this same journey, but like his predecessor, he considered the route impracticable for the return journey. It was only in 1812 that the Arinos and the Tapajóz were navigated successively up and down by Antônio Tomé de Souza and Miguel João de Souza, who had the glory of being the initiators of this means of internal communication in our country. The traffic, however, after continuing for some time, ceased completely. Beyond this navigation of purely commercial purposes, the Arinos and the Tapajóz were also visited by the expedition of Count de Lansdorff, who studied both scientifically in 1827, and that of the geographer William Chandless, which took place in 1861. But the elements collected by the first were never published, and those of the second, whilst constituting the essence of all the information which we possessed up to that time with regard to these rivers, did not, however, comprise the total course of the Arinos, neither did they give a regular topographical plan of same, and still less of its levels. As it was necessary to eliminate from the geography of our country such a considerable failing, I commissioned Lieutenant Júlio Caetano Horta Barbosa in 1914 to organize an expeditionary party with which he should leave Cuiabá for the headwaters of the Arinos and descend this river, exploring it carefully, so as to give us a complete and rigorous description of its entire course. Having organized a party with 14 workmen, a physician, Dr. João Meira, and a naturalist, Mr. João Geraldo Kuhlmann, Lieutenant Júlio Caetano left the capital of Mato Grosso on the 17th of October of last year, in the direction of Brotas, Guia, and Rosário, which, as we know, are situated in the valley of the river Cuiabá, to the east of the Serra do Tombador. After Rosário, but before Diamantino, the telegraph line, which the members of the expedition were following, crosses the headwaters of the Ribeirão da Serragem, a tributary of the right bank of the Cuiabá. It was from the bridge over this crossing that Lieutenant Júlio Caetano commenced the studies with which he was entrusted, and the first part of which consisted in reconnoitring the headwaters of this river. After having passed the Quiabó and the Cuiabazinho, its affluents of the right bank, the expedition crossed the two principal feeders of the Cuiabá, respectively called Cuiabá da Larga and Cuiabá do Bonito, the point of confluence of which is at a distance of 196,600 meters from the bridge over the Ribeirão da Serragem. The headwaters of these two feeders run in opposite directions, those of the first with the rivers Genipapeiro and Pialas, feeder of the Telles Pires, and those of the second with the river Beija-Flor, an affluent of the Telles Pires, and the river Novo, the principal branch of the Arinos. From the valley of the Cuiabá do Bonito, Lieutenant Júlio Caetano passed over to that of the river Telles Pires, where he went over the polygon determined by the headwaters known as Córrego Fundo, Chapadão, Beija-Flor, Mutum, Verde, and others, and finally arrived on the 9th of October at the plain whence flows the river Novo. Proceeding with the studies, still by land, Lieutenant Júlio Caetano reached the point of the confluence of this river with the branch which comes, right from the source, with the name of Arinos, and on taking the necessary measurements, he found for this river a width of 30 meters, and a discharge per second of 3,938 liters, and for the former a width of 28 meters and a discharge of 30,744 liters. The considerable superiority of this last volume, combined with a larger extension and the direction of the course, which prolongs that of the main river, give to the river Novo the necessary characteristics for it to be considered not a simple affluent of the other branch, but the superior part of the main collector of this basin. Against the above-mentioned elements, decisive in the choice of the principal branch of a river, the anthropogeographical consideration, which consists in the fact that the dwellers of the locality usually point out the other branch as being the preponderant, cannot prevail, and it became, however, necessary to make in the books and maps the correction now indicated by these data. From the bridge over the Ribeirão da Serragem, as far as the confluence of the two branches of the Arinos, the topographical survey revealed a journey of 447,000 meters. There, the exploration by the river was initiated, and was continued as far as the entrance into the Juruena. From the bulk of the work done, resulted not only the extension of the Arinos becoming known, which is 828,364 meters, but also all the affluents of both banks, its waterfalls and rapids, the barometric leveling of its bed, the geographical coordinates obtained from astronomical observations from 5 known points of its course, the constitution of its flora and that of its soil, studied by Dr. Eusébio de Oliveira on samples of rock brought to this capital by Lieutenant Júlio Caetano. Of the affluents noted, I will mention the following as they are the most important. From the right bank, the Ribeirão da Prata, the river dos Patos, whose width at the mouth is 23.5 meters, discharging a volume of 2,686 meters per second. The Marapó or São Cosme, with a width of 30 meters, a volume of 30,137 liters, and at whose mouth Lieutenant Júlio Caetano registered the last recent vestiges which he had been encountering from the headwaters of the presence of Indians, probably the Bacairis. The Tapauninha, with a width of 18 meters and a volume of 12,600 liters. The Pari or São Miguel, having a width of 27.5 meters at the mouth and discharging 32,503 liters. The Peixes, or as the Apiacás called it, the Itamiami, of 110 meters width with a volume of 249,043 liters. And finally, a Ribeirão, to which Lieutenant Júlio Caetano gave the name of Apiacás, below the falls called by Antônio Tomé Três Irmãs, Three Sisters, as, according to his words, it is divided into 3 interrupted streams. From the left bank, the Arinos received the river Preto, whose mouth measures 20 meters in width, and whose discharge is 8,033 liters per second. The telegraph line passes close to the headwaters feeding this river. The Sumidouro, of which Lieutenant Júlio Caetano ascended and surveyed a section of 36,854 meters, and measured the mouth and the volume, finding for the first a width of 55 meters, and for the second 213,554 liters. The headwaters of this river is cut by the telegraph line after passing the Parecis station at a point in which it already presents itself with a width of 10 meters. The river Parecis, with a width of 37 meters at the mouth. The Tapanhuna, with a width of 37 meters and a volume of 78,742 liters. And finally, the Sararé, whose mouth is to be found almost immediately after the largest waterfall of the Arinos, called by Antônio Tomé Recife Grande. The navigation for the study of the Arinos, begun on the 29th of November, only terminated on the 29th of December, the date on which Lieutenant Júlio Caetano's expedition entered the Juruena and commenced to descend same, facing the troubles and dangers of the section of the waterfalls, which made it practically impossible to use this river above the Tapajóz as a means of communication. In order to give an example of the nature of these obstacles, I will cite at random the following passage from Lieutenant Júlio Caetano's report referring to one of these. On the 3rd, we marched fairly well up to 12 o'clock. We then entered over travessões and rapids, which are to be found above the São João da Barra waterfall. At 1:25 p.m., we were 1,471 meters from the port where we were to rest, at the crest of the waterfall. However, it was only at 6 o'clock in the evening that we arrived there. This is a very dangerous section, owing to the condition of the river at the time. The waters rushed wildly and were very agitated, making a terrible noise. We had to pass first clinging on to the rocks which form a strong scarp on the left bank, and afterwards holding on to a rope held by a man who jumped from one boulder to the other, whilst another with a long rod kept the canoes, impelled by the waters, from beating against the rocks. Later this became impossible, and then, whilst some with hooks from the inside of the canoes searched for some salients on the slippery rocks to secure seine and not let the canoes precipitate themselves below with the current, others with rods avoided them being knocked up against the rocks. After a number of frights and much labor, we succeeded at last in arriving at the place where we were to stop, so as to transport the baggage by land to below the waterfalls, which we did, having previously tied up the empty canoes by the bow and stern with short hawsers. This work was only concluded after 8 p.m. under a downfall of rain, for the cargo had to be carried over a mound of almost 10 meters in height and of difficult access. On the following day we ascertained that the hawsers, which were holding the barges, had given way during the night. Fortunately, of this craft, one barge was found below the waterfall in calm water, and the loss of the other made no great difference to us, for the consumption of the victuals had greatly diminished our baggage. We will still cite the following passage from the same report. Next to the waterfall of Santa Iria, there is that of Santa Úrsula, more dangerous still than the previous one, and where the Canal do Inferno is to be found. The river passed through a canyon, and below, in a short curve closely confined between rocks of from 7 to 10 meters in height, the waters beat against the boulders of the banks and form large whirlpools which twirl one after the other, and the entire width of the river they continually fall to pieces with a thundering noise, leaving on the surface the whitish surf of stormy waters. This is the Misericordia waterfall, formed by enormous and dangerous curves and rapids. The banks are composed of high rocks that only leave a width of 90 meters for the passage of all that volume of water which, above the Salto Augusto, extends itself on an average with a width of more than 1 kilometer. Overcoming all the difficulties of navigation in such turbulent waters, the members of the expedition arrived on the 18th of January of the current year at the Revenue Office of the State of Mato Grosso, immediately below the bar of the river Telles Pires. Thence, Lieutenant Julio Caetano, with 5 men of his expedition, directed himself to the port of Airi Velho, on the Tapajóz, for the purpose of reconnoitring and surveying a portage road to the river Sucunduri. Here are the words in which this officer himself refers to the objective of this undertaking and the result of his studies. Some of the dwellers on the banks of the Tapajóz were very desirous of opening up, by this portage road, a route for automobiles, so as to get round the big falls of the Tapajóz. A similar road would bring enormous advantage to the industrious people of the São Manoel and the upper Tapajóz, but this would only be convenient if it were inexpensive, if it came out below all the waterfalls of the Sucunduri, and if at this point this river were open to navigation during the whole of the year. None of these conditions existed, however. The country is very mountainous, full of small rivers and swamps, and would render the construction of the proposed road extremely expensive. And besides this, the bar of the Meriti is above the last waterfalls of the Sucunduri, which, in its turn, is not navigable during the whole of the year, except by small craft. And especially now that the navigation of the Tapajóz is being carried out in gasoline motor launches with great economy of time, it appears to be more economical and advantageous to adapt the traffic of automobiles to the cart road already existing between Pimental and Bela Vista, with an extension of 17,700 meters, or the construction of a narrow gauge railway in this section, the only one which cannot be crossed by the craft. The study and survey of the portage road in question, which could not be carried out in 1911 by an European explorer whose name has on many occasions been cited in the newspaper of this capital, was easily executed in the space of 12 days by Lieutenant Júlio Caetano. This work measured 67,200 meters, divided into two sections. The first, of 49,700 meters, extends from the port of Aire Velho to the Igarapé-Meriti, whose mouth gave a width of 15 meters and a volume of 1,610 liters of water. And the second, of 17,300 meters, joins the above-mentioned Igarapé to the river Sucunduri. On the completion of this service, the members of the Arinos expedition continued to descend the Tapajóz up to the Porto de São Luís, where they arrived on the 15th of February, and from there left for the city of Santarém, embarking in a steamer of the regular service of the Amazonas-Tapajóz line. Taken on the whole, the work carried out by Lieutenant Júlio Caetano on this expedition comprised, of topographical survey alone, the extension of 2,129 kilometers 923 meters, of which a part, to the extent of a little less than 514 kilometers, was done on foot, and all the rest by the river. This enormous effort finished at the end of 4 months, starting from the day on which he left the capital of Mato Grosso, and he was so fortunate that it did not cost the life nor the health of a single member of the expedition. With the conclusion of this undertaking, the Telegraph Lines Commission set the last touch to the work which it had initiated in 1907, that is to say, of discovering and studying the river Juruena and the whole hydrographic basin which depends upon it. Considered, however, from a geographical point of view, this work seemed to us to require an important complement. Really, the river to which we give the name of Juruena is the same as that which, after receiving its contribution from the Telles Pires, continues to descend to the Amazon with the name of Tapajóz. One is a continuation of the other, and probably the diversity of the names resulted only from the fact that the Portuguese discoverers had arrived at this great fluvial artery from the lower and from the upper part of its course. Those who came from the Amazon encountered for the first time its mouth, naturally calling it after the name which the Indians on the banks of the Rio Mar know it. Others, however, had to guide themselves according to the information of the inhabitants of the highlands, from which it springs, and from whom probably it received a new name. But, whichever may be the origin and the reason of this duplicity of names, and it is certain that the course Juruena-Tapajóz forms one only geographical feature, it continues intact, just as much from a hydrographical as from a geological and botanical point of view. The description of the one, therefore, should never be considered complete unless it comprised that of the other. We had really terminated the first, but we did not consider that we could give our work as entirely finished whilst essential elements with regard to the second were wanting. Moreover, even if we wished to see in the Juruena a simple feeder of the Tapajóz, without any other name except that of its former São Manoel, it is clear that the study of this should accompany the study of the other, as a necessary complement of the plan which we were desirous of organizing. End of section 24.
Section 25 of the Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition and the Telegraph Line Commission. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition and the Telegraph Line Commission by Candido Rondon, translated by R.G. REIDY and Edwin Murray. Third lecture, Part 12. Having therefore decided to proceed with the exploration and the regular survey of the river Telles Pires, in February last, Lieutenant Antonio Parintintis de Souza left from Tapirapoan at the head of an expeditionary column composed of 6 men, a physician, Dr. Alberto Moore, and a naturalist, Mr. Antenor Pires. Taking the direction of the telegraph station of Afonsos, from the branch of the Barro dos Bugres, the expedition ascended to the Chapadao dos Parecis, passed by the place called Arroz Sem Sal, to which I alluded in my first lecture in 1911, and from there reached the Ribeirão do Estivado, the direct affluent from the left bank of the Arinos, which is cut by the telegraph line from Cuiabá to the Madeira. From Estivado he continued by the divisor of the waters of the Arinos and of the Cuiabá, joining his march to that of Lieutenant Julio Caetano, and having reached the headwaters of the river Novo, passed from there across a chapadao of black soil covered by a cerrado to the headwaters of the river Verde at a distance of 2 kilometers from the above, and already belonging to the hydrographical basin of the river Telles Pires. From there commenced the studies which were the object of Lieutenant Pyreneus's expedition. The river Telles Pires, for which the topographical survey registered a total extension of 1,386 kilometers from the last headwaters of the principal one of its feeders up to the point of the confluence with the Juruena, is the result of the union of 2 branches. The more important and the more northerly one rises in the Serra do Açul under the name of Parataninga, which it keeps during its course of 124 kilometers, at the end of which it arrives with a width of 34 meters, its greatest depth being 5.5 meters and its volume 72 cubic meters discharged every second. There it meets, or rather receives, the other branch, to which I propose it should conserve its old name of São Manoel, taken from the trunk to which will be applied the name of the unfortunate Captain Telles Pires. As a matter of fact, the São Manoel is nothing more or less than an affluent from the left bank of the Paranatinga. Its course measures scarcely 74 kilometers in extension. Its width at the mouth is 25 meters, its greatest depth 3.5 meters, and the discharge 42 cubic meters. The river Verde, at whose headwaters Lieutenant Pyreneus arrived after leaving those of the Novo, is a tributary from the left bank of the Telles Pires. From there the members of the expedition left for the confluence of the São Manoel with the Parintinga, which they ascended in pirogas, canoes, made out of the bark of the jatoba, obtained in the Indian villages of the Bacahiris, established at the port used by Van den Stein and by Colonel Paulo Castro in order to cross the above-mentioned river towards the Xingu. Thus assisted by the Indians, Lieutenant Pyreneus could get as far as the last headwaters of the Parintinga, at a place where the dwellers of the wilds of this river do not go, out of fear of meeting the Kayapos, who they suppose live there, and of whom they are afraid. Descending afterwards from these headwaters to the mouth, Lieutenant Pyreneus noted all the special features of the river Telles Pires, and proceeded with the necessary work for the future drawing of the topographical chart, the description of its fauna, forests, and soil. The number of affluents registered and measured in the whole length of its course reaches 25, of which many are still without names. Of these, the most important are, from the right bank, the river Caiopó, with a volume of 62 cubic meters and a width of 30 meters, the Celeste, 751 kilometers from the headwaters of the Paranatinga, with a width of 33 meters and an average discharge of 33 cubic meters, the Paixoto de Acevedo, whose name was given by Lieutenant Pyreneus in homage to the memory of the first explorer of the former São Manoel, with a width of 42 meters and a discharge of 17 cubic meters. It is a river of dark and motionless waters. The Cristalino, named for the first time, with a width of 55 meters and a discharge of 154 cubic meters. It is 1,019 kilometers from the headwaters of the Paranatinga. The São Benedicto, with a width of 102 meters and a volume of 103 cubic meters. The Cururu, with a width of 75 meters at the mouth and a volume of 89. On the left bank, the river Verde, 656 kilometers from the headwaters of the Paranatinga, with 90 meters at the mouth and 202 cubic meters discharge. It is the largest of the feeders of the Telles Pires. With regard to the waterfalls, Lieutenant Pyreneus noted and described 45, of which 13 exist in the river Paranatinga. And with regard to absolute falls, they are not more than 3 in number. The first, called Magasi, is at 339 kilometers from the principal headwaters, and is formed by 3 successive falls, giving a total change of level of 13.5 meters. Below this, on the left bank, there is a grotto which was visited by Lieutenant Pyreneus, who then found there the inscription with the name Telles, and a date of 1889 carved in a stone. Above the fall, the width of the river is 102 meters, and its depth almost reaches 6½ After it, however, these measures are increased respectively to 150 and to 17 meters, this height having been found in one of the 2 wells which are formed there. At this place, Lieutenant Pyreneus fished a paraiba, which measured 1 meter and 90 centimeters in length. 11 kilometers after passing the Sete Quedas, Lieutenant Pyreneus's expedition met the 3rd and last fall of the river which he was exploring. This is the old Salto Tavares, having 12 successive terraces which reach out to an extension of 4 kilometers, forming the sole serious obstacle against navigation. It does not, however, render it impossible. This is the fall where, on the 3rd of May, 1890, the shipwreck and death of the unfortunate Captain Antonio Lorenzo Telles Pires occurred, and whose expedition lost at this place all the resources which it possessed, and which rendered it impossible for the then Lieutenant Oscar de Miranda, adjutant and devoted companion to that chief, to proceed on the journey and to come out on the Tapajóz. We all still remember quite well the sad catastrophe and the martyrdom undergone at the time by the survivors, thrown on the banks of the river, deprived of any means of action, for lack of implements, which had been lost, and exhausted by fever and by the horrors of hunger. We all remember further that it was only due to the diligent solicitude of another officer of our army, a friend and companion of the above named, the present General Jimeno Villaroy, that we are indebted for having been spared the extra sorrow of which we were threatened, and of which he saved us by sending out from Manaos, where he had assumed the government of the state as the delegate of the provisional government of the Republic recently proclaimed in our country, a rescue expedition, which after ascending the Tapajóz and the old São Manoel, succeeded in arriving in time to snatch from death the few still surviving members of the unfortunate expedition. At 769 kilometers below this, the river Telles Pires forms another fall, known under the name of Sete Quedas, since the days of the voyage of exploration of the lieutenant of the militia Peixoto de Acevedo. The canoes are able to cross this fall easily, for it does not offer any difficulty to navigation. If the appeal which I have addressed to you, Mr. President of the Geographical Society, and to your worthy co-associates, in the sense that you should accept as your own and recommend to the geographers of our country the idea of rendering homage to the memory of the much regretted Captain Telles Pires, should meet with your approval, this fall will henceforward be honored in being designated by the illustrious name of Oscar de Miranda. Leaving out other information of geographical value collected by the expedition under Lieutenant Pyreneus, because for this the time at my disposal would not be sufficient, I shall make a rapid allusion to the indigenous tribes found on the river Telles Pires. In the first place, I shall cite the Cayabis, although this primacy does not pertain to them after the chronological order in which they were met. It was only after passing the mouth of the river Verde, and before the falls of the Sete Quedas on the waterfalls called Coatá, that the first village of these Indians was observed, but from this point downwards 5 more were noted. Lieutenant Pyreneus informs me that the Cayabis are strong Indians, fairly tall, good canoemen, and great planters of corn, monkey nuts, manioc, potatoes, and other useful plants such as cotton. Neither the men nor the women use any sort of clothing. They weave cotton to make their hammocks, in which they sleep, and the sashes, some narrow and short for their hips, which they use after the Nhambiquara fashion. They pierce their ears, and use very interesting earrings. They allow their hair to grow, and have the habit of tying it up at the back of the head. The women pull out the hair on their bodies. They used to offer the produce of their plantations in exchange for axes, apinaco, machetes, apinum, clothes, and principally for hats. They are much afraid of firearms, but are perhaps still more fearsome of being poisoned. It is certainly in order to avoid this danger that they rejected all the food which was offered to them by the expedition, always on the pretense that they were suffering from their teeth, notwithstanding that they possessed these in a magnificent condition. At first, says Lieutenant Pyreneus, the Cayabis afforded me a good reception, but when the provision of axes and of machetes was exhausted, they began to attack me at the falls and at other places difficult to cross. It was, however, sufficient to cause our guns to be fired, for them to run off and leave us in peace. After the waterfalls, they attempted a night attack against our bivouac, probably armed with clubs. I avoided it, however, by transporting myself at night with all my personnel and baggage to the other side of the river. I had 4 assaults which I prudently avoided in order not to cause them any harm, and I endeavored to make them understand that I was going to return, bringing them apinacos, axes, and apinim, machetes. On the night when I moved my camp, passing from one side to the other without being seen, I avoided a struggle which one of their chiefs wished to provoke, entering into the water with his bow and arrows, and threatening with loud shouts. While he was given up to this mad bravado, from the interior of the woods on both sides the war cries became greater, coming from many men whom we did not see. On arriving at the opposite bank we tied up our canoes and remained in them awaiting events. In the morning we perceived that the Indians were penetrating into the abandoned camp, and were beating all around it screaming, which served them more for the purpose of animating them rather than of frightening the adversary. They were certainly very much upset when they found out the trick which had been played upon them." Such are the episodes which occurred among the Indians called Cayabis or Cahabis in Lieutenant Pyreneus's expedition. Before, however, this officer had been in the villages of the Bacairis, of whom he gives us the following information. "Below the bars of the São Manoel and of the Cayapo, I met the Bacahiri Indians, who live there in 3 malocas, one belonging to the old Captain Antonino, who served as a guide to the German expedition to reach the headwaters of the Xingu. The other belonged to Captain Carutu, who 2 years ago had come from that river accompanied by a great number of Indians, who had almost all died from influenza and fetico, on arrival at Telles Pires. And finally, the third, belonging to Capitão José Coroado, the son of the celebrated Indian woman Rosa, who died in January 1813 in this same village. The Bacahiris, adds Lieutenant Pyreneus, are half civilized and suffer a good deal from the bad treatment of the rubber tappers, who explore their work in tapping rubber trees, in breeding cattle, and on their plantations. They constantly make voyages to the Xingu, in order to visit the villages of their tribe which exist there. On the Telles Pires their number is small, and the tendency is to their complete disappearance, in consequence of the slavery to which they are reduced by the rubber tappers and other dwellers on the river, who explore and vitiate them." Of all these facts, all of them equally interesting, there is one which requires special mention. That is the one which refers to the Indian woman, Rosa Bororo. To the pen of a lady, the wife of General Melo Rego, we owe the fact of not having lost the remembrance of the great work rendered by that poor woman to her nation of origin, and also to the great part of the population of the former province of Mato Grosso, including that of the surroundings of Cuyaba. For many years the Bororo tribe of the river São Lourenço lived in open warfare against the civilized people, whom they hostilized in terrible attacks in the interior of their houses and establishments, killing many, disorganizing the traffic on the rivers and on the roads, and the work on numerous and important breeding estates where they played the greatest havoc. For such evil, the president of the province found no remedy except the organizing of a war of reprisal, having in view the extermination of the Indians. The direction of the formidable beats which were then commenced was entrusted to Lieutenant Duarte, a brave and decided man, but incapable of liberating himself of the illusionary fascination which springs up from the idea that the value of physical force is absolute, to smooth over the disorders which arise amongst groups of human beings as the result of a different civilization, prejudices of race, letting loose of one's passions, in fact, that arise from the state of mind which conducted antiquity to place the foreigner and the enemy under the same heading. One can easily imagine, therefore, to what point of cruelty arrived in a very short time the hostilities between the Bororos and the contingent commanded by Lieutenant Duarte. War was thus raging, and from day to day it took larger proportions and recommenced, when suddenly among the Indians who were taken prisoners to Cuyaba, and who lived there in masked slavery, a young girl offered herself first, and afterwards asked insistently to be permitted to accompany Lieutenant Duarte's expedition in one of his beats against the villages of her people. She promised to cause the war to cease, to save the rest of the persecuted nation, and restore calm and quiet to the population of Cuyaba, and to all the region ravaged by the raids of the warriors of the river São Lourenço. Received at first without attention, and afterwards with mistrust, the Bororo girl found a means, nevertheless, to persevere with such enthusiasm and fervor in this proposal, that she finally succeeded in overcoming the general lack of interest, and more still the pride of those who considered themselves so immensely superior to her, that it was difficult for them to admit the possibility of having to alter and to abandon their plans and their combinations, in order to adopt those of a miserable Indian slave. On one of his customary expeditions, Lieutenant Duarte took with him the Bororo girl. On arriving at a certain spot on the river São Lourenço, stripping herself of her city clothes, she interned herself into the forest, and at the end of the number of days previously combined with the commander of the detachment, she returned to the place where the latter was awaiting her, bringing with her the Page Magera, or the chief of the tribe of the Bororos, who came, convinced by her to make peace and to become friendly with the civilized people, represented in the person of the same man who up to then had persecuted them with untold of atrocities. After this memorable act, the pacific relations of that nation with the civilized people were never broken, and the services which they have rendered in the swampy lands of the Paraguay are most valuable. Amongst others, I will recall to you that which I myself received when I was entrusted with the construction of the telegraph lines of the south of Mato Grosso. During a whole year, the work effected by these Indians was carried out by over 500 of them, who were incessantly at my orders. The Bororo girl, to whom we owe this beautiful page of the history of our country, who was the essence of the sweetness and kindness which is exhaled from those who tell the story without equal of the admirable Marina, so was this Rosa, whose son Lieutenant Pyreneus met on the river Telles Pires, who assisted him personally, and with his people, to take him to the highest headwaters of the Parantinga. On information received from Lieutenant Pyreneus, Rosa Bororo died in January of this year in a Bakahiri settlement, of which her son was the chief. Her memory, therefore, still lives in the hearts of those who knew of her short and touching history, and certainly the same will live whilst there is a Brazilian heart to vibrate with love and gratitude on recalling to mind the figure of whomever it may be, large or small, who may have given occasion by words, deeds, or sentiments, to inscribe in the pages of the history of the country one more trace which may contribute to the realization of the wish of the Maranhão poet, where he says, "I see a nation of heroes." Mr. President of the Geographical Society, I had promised you, as well as your illustrious associates, the data which appeared to me necessary to enable you to judge by its real value the nature and the extent of the services which you have attributed to me in the realization of the work carried to a successful end by the Telegraph Lines Commission from Mato Grosso to the Amazon. I now consider fulfilled and completed the promise which I made, although I have yet to refer to work of considerable technical importance carried out by my distinguished assistants, and which concur decisively to give to that work the touch of scientific exactness with which it is shown. Thus, for example, I have not described the astronomical service mounted in Cuiabá by Captain Renato Barbosa Rodrigues Pereira, in direct correspondence with the Rio de Janeiro Observatory for the rigorous determination of the geographical coordinates of the principal points of the territory of Mato Grosso. I would have in regard to this matter to refer to the means and the results already obtained on the eastern line with the friendly and competent assistance of Dr. Henrique Maurice and Dr. Domingos Costa, Director and Assistant of our National Observatory. But, in spite of such great failings, the exposition which I here offer you, and whose benevolent and honored acceptance I declare myself eternally grateful to the ladies and distinguished gentlemen of this audience, as well as to you, Mr. President of the Geographical Society, it is sufficient to demonstrate to evidence that it is not to me, but to the Brazilians represented by the governments of the 4 successive administrations of the Republic, by the officers and soldiers of our valorous army, and by the humble, diligent efforts of the dwellers of the wilds, which constitute the foundation of our nationality, to them should be directed the homage of your thanks, of your admiration for the gigantic work carried out in the wilds of our country. To me nothing else is due except the satisfaction of being proud of being the son of such a country, and of seeing my name associated with that of other sons who have devotedly served and loved the same. But if persisting in the friendly violence of your good will, you insist, in wishing to transform in personal merit my pride of having cooperated for the raising up of our nationality, I am forced to open up to you my heart and my soul, to show you the real motives of all my sentiments and of all my strength, the fountain whence spring the inspirations and the energy of my life, the heroine who gave herself up to all sorts of privations and to all the hardships of long and repeated absences, to all the worry in imagining by thought all these privations and terrible risks to which I have placed myself for more than 25 years in this life of an eternal exile in my own country. In fact, to show you, as you will have already understood, you all, "who have the intellect of love," that the efforts you attribute to me do not belong to me, but to my noble wife, at whose feet I deposit as they are due to her all the applause and the flowers which you have accumulated around me in your unlimited generosity of men born in this beautiful country, our dear Mother of infinite grace. End of section 25. End of The Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition and the Telegraph Line Commission by Candido Rondon. Translated by R.G. Reedy and Edwin Murray.